Welcome to Homicide Life on the Set, a podcast about the Emmy Award-winning television show Homicide Life on the Street, with myself, Chris Carr, and Susan Ingram. On today's podcast, we're joined by actor Reed Diamond, who played Detective Mike Kellerman. On the episode, Reed shares with us his formative experiences of being on the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. Susan, how are you?
Hey, good. Looking forward to getting this Reed episode out to our listeners. I think they'll really enjoy it.
Yeah, indeed. Well, yeah, Reed. So today we have Reed Diamond, Detective Mike Kellerman, retired, and now PI. Yeah.
There's the new show, Reed, Detective.
Yeah. Why isn't there a Reed Diamond, Mike Kellerman spin-off? There we are. Yeah, Mike
PI.
Kellerman, PI. That'd be quite cool. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah. Tom Fontana, are you listening? We need a new show.
Indeed. So we got Reed Diamond today, and honestly, this is a fantastic interview. Reed, I think it's nearly 2 hours. Reed was, right off the bat wanted to get going, and I suggest everybody pour yourself your favorite drink, sit back and enjoy the ride. I think there's a lot of great anecdotes in here. And obviously, one technical note, since this episode was recorded, it's been announced that the rights issues that were preventing Homicide for streaming have now been resolved, which is great, but there's no firm word yet as of when and where the show will be streamed. But other than that, I think those are the only real key things to say before we jump into it.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things too is the historical context he gives about the show and what was happening in the 90s with television, which was really interesting. And also, I'd just like to say, although this will be online for a long time, happy birthday to him, because he has a birthday in July, in the third week of July. And I believe his wife's birthday is actually July 4th, the day this episode is dropping. So happy birthday to you too.
Yes, happy birthday. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and we will go straight in.
Can we just jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Let's just jump in because like I said to Susan and I said to you in the emails, Homicide holds a incredibly significant place. So let me just start off by confessing I didn't sleep last night.
Oh, wow.
And because I didn't sleep, and it's interesting because yesterday in preparation for this, I watched a bunch of episodes on YouTube, and I'm not the kind of actor who watches himself. I don't really go backwards, and it was intense. So let me just start off by saying, as your other guests have said, yes, this was the most exceptional and important creative experience of my life. But it's more than that, right? Because yes, Mike Kellerman is the greatest character that I've ever had the great good fortune to play.
Right.
But as much as it was a transformational artistic experience, it so informed my life and changed who I am, not only as an actor, but changed who I was as a man. And it was, so to come on here and try to talk about, what was my time? Because I do lots of shows, and I can talk about my time on Journeyman or my time in the MCU or whatever the heck it is, judging Amy, because those are jobs, and I can talk about the job. But this was like saying, hey, tell us about high school, because the guy who showed up for Fire Part 1 is not the guy who left with Kellerman PI or Fallen Heroes Part 2. So this was not only a profound, as I said, artistic experience. I think about it all the time, and it truly set me on the course to who I became, for good and ill. It wasn't an all. It certainly wasn't a cushy, fuzzy experience, but it was the greatest artistic experience I've ever had. And I remember when I left, and we could talk about this more, about how Tom and I decided to leave, I remember sitting in my car on Thames Street and just sobbing because because I didn't know I was going to come back for the PI stuff. And, and I couldn't believe that I wasn't going to get to be Mike Kellerman ever again. And it still gets me emotional now. And as far as Homicide goes, I also feel like it's really important to frame what this show was, because especially for a modern audience, because what's hard to conceive of is the world that this show was made in. This was a network television show for NBC. At the time, there were three, and then Fox had really just started as the fourth major television network. And Fox obviously had gone to great heights now with the X-Files. But we're making a network television show. Basic cable didn't exist yet. HBO, you'll probably know this better than I think maybe Larry Sanders had started, but they hadn't jumped in. They'd made Our List, but they hadn't jumped into dramas. Basically, Tom started them with Oz and then Sopranos. But the world that we made this show in doesn't exist anymore, right? So you're making a network television show. And also, what I think it's hard for people to understand too, or to conceive of, is in the mid-90s, in the 90s, there was television and there was film.
Yeah.
And neither the twain should ever meet. Film actors weren't going to do television, and television actors hoped to do film, but that was to make that transition was so rare. And here we were making this renegade TV show that could only have been made on location in Baltimore with these people, with these incredibly talented and brilliant people. But you got these directors and you got these film actors who came to do it. So, and then we made 22. But I think, when I talk about Homicide, we also made a cutting edge cop show on network television with no profanity, right? And
That's true.
Which is hard, right?
I just think about it now.
It's on a network show, and obviously lots of innuendo, and it's interesting. I love that it never got. In retrospect, at the time, I was outraged that it didn't get the Emmy love that it deserved, and you'd see the sort of usual suspects being nominated every year. But then I guess it was poetic and apropos that it never did receive that. It's like they were the Pixies, they were the Replacements. It wasn't we weren't U2, right, or Backstreet Boys. It was that special show, and getting to make it couldn't have been made by any other people, and it had to be made in Baltimore. But that's that's my little beginning.
So Reed, honestly, what an introduction there. Thank you for sharing all that. And it's a real honor to have you on. And I was saying this to Carl, it's sort of, for me, a very strange experience, because I sort of known you for so long as Mike Kellerman to now meet you as Reed Diamond. It's
right.
Like, wow, it's quite a thing. So
I'm slightly different. I feel like Kyle is closer to Bayless in real life. Yeah. Kellerman was sort of the person I wanted to be, but and my soft little crunchy center would get out every once in a while. But sorry, go ahead. Yeah, it's lovely to meet you. Yeah, it's great to see Susan. As I was saying before we started, it's just like when I think of Homicide, Susan's face is one of the first ones that pops up. And so I just love that you guys are doing this, and I've loved listening to so far the first two podcasts I've been out, and it was so cool, like hearing people's perspectives and hearing their voices and learning new things, but then also being just pulled instantly back to those feelings from 30 years, half my life ago when I started this show. Literally half my life ago. And it was cool. And I just worked with Jean, and it's always like a week before his episode aired. And it's just so cool when you work with like old Homicide friends. Like I worked with Alex, our other DP, Josefsky, for like a half of 6 months on Bosch. And it's just and obviously I've worked with Clark many times, which we'll definitely, I'm sure we'll talk about, but it's so cool to see those guys because you've been through something. It's like meeting your old platoon mates, right? You stormed from Normandy all the way to Berlin, and those were hard days, but when you see each other, it's all love and happiness and confidence in each other. I mean, it's so funny to work with somebody like Jean or Alex as directors, and obviously I worked with them as directors starting on Homicide as well, but just the confidence they have in you and the fun and the shorthands we still have this many years later. And then whenever you run into anyone, I mean, when I lived in LA, I'd see Kyle all the time, and it's a kinder, gentler period.
I suppose after your great introduction, it might be interesting to chat a little bit about the beginning of your acting career and how you ended up on Homicide. So maybe
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit about sort of you're at Juilliard, weren't you?
Yeah. So let me start a little bit in the middle of the story and then
Yeah,
I'll move backwards if that's okay.
that's
Because
cool. It's very postmodern. I like it.
yeah, so let's do it. Exactly. It's just like how every show starts now. Let me give you exactly the inciting incident and then we'll go
Yeah.
backwards. So it's, I guess I'm very naive in so many ways. And it was only a few years ago that it hit me like a diamond bullet that the reason I was brought on the show for the beginning of for season 4 for the second full season of the show were probably not the reasons that I thought I was
Mm.
brought on the show,
Mm-hmm.
and also the intentions that I showed up there with, which
Yeah.
I'll tell you about, were probably not what anyone had in mind.
Yeah.
So certainly that was brought home especially after listening to Tom and Julie and Jorge.
Mm.
I think now, well, I've never discussed this with Tom, but I would imagine I was brought on to be the hunk or be hunky. And obviously I never saw myself that way. And I had been preparing, as we'll talk about, for about 3 years to play this part. And the genius of Tom Fontana and the beauty of this show was, I think they had an idea for me. I know they had an idea for me. I guess he used to refer to it originally as frat boy with a gun. And I had a different idea of who the character was, and through that, our two streams melded, and I had the great good fortune to have one of the most exciting arcs of any
Yeah.
character on television. But so,
Yes, indeed.
and to go backwards just a little bit before that, so I think, well, yeah, I'll tell you my actor's journey. So I grew up in New York City,
Yeah.
which was very fortunate for a young budding actor. My mother had come to New York to be an actress, but she wasn't. She was an astrologer. She became an astrologer. My father was a television director at the local television station, Channel 9, WOR, and he directed the news, and probably most notably, he was a director of a show called The Joe Franklin Show. Which I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but Billy Crystal used to parody it on SNL. But what made Joe Franklin such an amazing show, I was just showing it to my family, was Joe was Broadway Joe Franklin. He knew everything about the history of the movies and Broadway. And so you could literally on the set have Bing Crosby sitting next to Tony DeMarco, who was a lounge singer in Paterson, New Jersey. And he's like, oh, I've got the great Tony DeMarco here. You're doing wonderful things. Bing, this is Tony. It was just, so everyone was a star. He was the most gracious host, and he was encyclopedic in his knowledge of trivia. And also thanks to him, because I don't know why. My father wasn't paid very much at Channel 9 for the local station. So all of our tickets, all the Broadway shows I saw back in the day that sort of really formed me were because Joe got comps to all the shows. So I was lucky to go to
Cool.
opening or close to opening of Sweeney Todd or whatever would be Annie, all the things that formed me. But so I grew up in the city. I was very fortunate. I think I kind of knew I wanted to be an actor for sure. Around 6th grade, even though I wrote an autobiography in 3rd grade, which is right. It's like what that seems like a silly task to assign an 8-year-old. So there wasn't much to write, and so I had it begins chapter 2. He's in school, but then I wrote chapter 4 was the future, and I said in the future I will have a van, and because it was the mid 70s, right? So everyone wanted a van with carpeting on the inside, and I'd written on the side, I'd drawn a picture of it, the Fonz, as in Arthur Fonzarelli. But then I turned the page and I said, and it had a picture, and I go, and I want to be an actor, and I'm going to be an actor. And I'd drawn a picture of myself in some sort of like Elizabethan ruffled collar standing in front of footlights. So somehow at 8, I knew. And then I was really fortunate when I got into high school. I went to high school on the Upper West Side. And when I started my freshman year, a new teacher, Michael Gilbert, came and started the theater. He was the theater teacher, and he came in and overhauled the entire program. And we were doing really incredible plays. He and another teacher, Al Romano. So we had 3 theaters. We had a black box theater, a main stage, a smaller theater upstairs. And by 10th grade, I knew for sure that's what I was going to do. I remember very clearly, just we were doing Jean Giraudoux Electra, and I'm backstage and hearing the opening music, and I'm about to come out, and I'm like, I love this. And I go, all I want to do is be a working actor, right? And I'm not sure if I was able to sort of presage that, or if I just cursed myself, because that's what I've been. I've been a working actor since, 1984,
Right.
85. And so then just by the sheer good fortune of being in New York City, I was doing a play my senior year, and my first representatives came and saw me there, and I'd already committed to it. So after my junior year of high school, I went for the summer. I was an apprentice up at Williamstown, the theater festival up in Massachusetts, and worked with a bunch of people who came and guest starred on Homicide later. And as a 16-year-old, and I was an apprentice there with Kiefer Sutherland. We were both apprentices
cool.
together, young men. And then, so my senior year in high school, I'm doing Diary of Anne Frank, and my first managers come and they sign me up, and I go to their offices down in Midtown in the morning. I sign my papers, and I go to my first audition for a commercial that afternoon. This is March of 1985.
Yeah.
I go to my first audition, and I get it. Right. So it ruined me, because I thought, oh, this is how the business is going to be. I'm going to get my first job. And I was very lucky. It was a commercial that aired during Live Aid in that summer. And,
wow. Yeah.
back then commercials ran for a long time. So that paid for the first couple of years of college. And I went to University of North Carolina for a little while, just because having grown up in New York, I wanted to leave. I wanted to go somewhere else. I wanted to go somewhere where I wasn't going to run into people that I knew from the city. But I knew I was going to be an actor. So I just wanted to, and I heard they had a good drama program. And I remember pretty early on when I was there that I go, everyone says I'm really good, but I don't feel really good. I feel like I need a little more competition. I want to be classically trained, because I had this vision of myself. I go, I want to play Lear in my 70s. And it just by happenstance, that weekend in the Sunday New York Times Magazine, the cover was on Yale Drama School and Juilliard, and it had many of a bunch of the alumni and some photo shoot. And I was only a sophomore in college at the time, and Yale was a graduate program. So I go, I can't go there. So I was like, I guess I'll go to Juilliard. And I didn't know that it was hard to get into. And at the time, my favorite actor was William Hurt, had gone there, and I thought, oh yeah, this is cool. So I called them up and I said, hey, could I have an audition for Juilliard? And they said, oh, you missed the deadline. It was due last week. I go, well, hey, there's this thing called Federal Express that's just come out. If I FedExed my application to you, think I could get an audition? And I said, sure. And I got it, and I got the audition. And I was lucky enough to get into Juilliard. And it was sheer ignorance on my part, because I didn't know that it was hard to get into, so I wasn't nervous, and I'd prepared some really sort of you had to do obviously a classical and a contemporary monologue. So for classical, I picked something, because for years I'd been doing Richard III. I started doing Richard III in high school, but I was like, I'm not going to do Richard III for this. I'm going to try something new, and I found some horrible, sort of very romantic kingly speech. I can't even remember what it was from at the time. And then for my contemporary, I picked Charlie Brown from You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, which I don't think was exactly Juilliard material. But it was funny because as I say, like I'd go to school during the year, and in the summers I was an actor. So I would go on auditions. At the time, it's just commercials. And so I would spend all summer in Manhattan just pounding the pavement and trying to get jobs. And so I thought, well, with commercials, usually if 100 people audition, 50 people get called back. So I thought that was going to be the deal at Juilliard. But I remember going and doing my audition in the morning, and the callbacks would go up in the afternoon. I went out and got some ramen and came back, and there were only 2 names on the list of the callbacks. And luckily I was one of them. And luckily I got in. And so right before I got Juilliard, I had to miss my first day of orientation because I got this commercial, and I remember it was for Subaru, and back then commercials ran forever, and I had to pay for Juilliard, and it was much more expensive than college, and so I said to the second head of the school, I was like, hey, I'm gonna have to miss orientation. He's like, well, we really frown upon that. I'm like, well, I need this money. And luckily, I missed a bit of orientation, but I got this commercial that actually paid for the first 2 years of Juilliard. But then, so as a first year student at Juilliard, that's the first time that I met the great Andre Braugher. So when I showed up in the fall, I was a first year student. It's a 4-year program, and Andre was in his 4th year, his senior year.
Mm.
And me
Wow.
and the guys who became my two best friends from my class at Juilliard, we got sort of pulled in to, or not pulled in. We were assigned. We had to be in the fourth year production, and at that time, Andre was playing Othello in Othello, and so me and my buddies, we played various small parts in that, and I got to see his brilliance, and he was a star then. I mean, there was obviously they picked Othello because of Andre, and he was obviously incredibly powerful actor. Shakespeare was just it was quite easy for him, and he was inspiring, and he was inspiring to watch, and how he held that performance. I think about it often, and so that was my first. So then I followed him to Juilliard 3 years later, and then I followed him to Homicide 3 years later. So
Yeah, so weird the happenstance, all those things along the way
yeah,
that you may have not connected with him there because you may have gotten in later or not
yeah.
gotten in on all those little happenstance.
It's really cool.
Yeah,
And
it's
it was
weird.
great to see him. I
Yeah.
mean, he was, and I say like he was a star. I mean, already before he even left there, they had pictures of him up in the walls at Juilliard as Othello, because it was an
Interesting.
incredible performance. And I'd see him every once in a while. I was at Juilliard because I remember he got on. They revised Kojak for a while with Telly Savalas, and he played a
Yeah.
detective on that. And then I remember Glory came out, and that was really exciting, and he was so good in that. But then, so I was at Juilliard, and then, like I say, I was going to school during the year, and in the summers I would act. And my second year at Juilliard, and like I said, it's a 4-year program. I got cast in this movie, shooting where you live, Chris, over in England. I got cast in this movie called Memphis Belle.
Oh, I remember that film.
Mhm.
My
Right. So it
God,
was
Yeah.
a film about a
Yeah.
B-17 bomber crew
That's
in the
it.
Second
Yeah.
World War, and it's
Yeah, I
also
remember seeing that in the theater.
right, yeah.
I went to see
And it was
Yeah.
also that's where the Kellerman brothers. I first met the Kellerman brothers because I made that movie with Eric Stoltz and Tate Donovan.
That's it.
And
Yeah,
so that's how that came to be. Because
Wow.
this was,
So strange.
funny.
isn't
and it was an
it?
amazing movie. It's talking about how sort of like of its time, how special in its time and unique and sui generis that Homicide is. It was so cool that this was my first movie. Another thing that ruined me, like it was to have my first movie. We're 4 months in England. We went to boot camp. We're only the second movie ever to do a boot camp. The first one, which Finnerty worked on, was Platoon. So Finnerty was like key grip, right? Jim Finnerty was key grip on Platoon.
Yeah,
And they sent those boys, they did Dale Dye, famous Dale Dye, ex-Marine. He did the boot camp for those guys. We got sent down to Dartmoor, where the Royal Marines train, and we did a week at Lord Fulford's Manor. He was like an ex-SAS guy, and he had a manor house down there. You probably know some of these guys, Chris. And so we had a bunch of these ex-SAS Royal Marines guys take us through. And in fact, Lord Fulford had built a full sort of like obstacles course on his property, on his manor. And all he did all day, it was great because it was like upper class twit of the year. Not that he was a twit, but it was like the Monty Python bit where all he just drank and shot all day long. He just had shooting parties. I mean, I kid you not. It was like and his manor house had been in the family forever, but they were on the wrong side somewhere of one of the civil wars. Maybe I don't know. They didn't seem Cromwellian, but it was like, so there was battle flags everywhere. But I became best friends with Tate and Eric while we were during boot camp because we were out on maneuvers one night. They gave us like AK-47s with blanks, and we had to go chase down some Royal Marines. And we had the 3 of us slept in a one-man tent, while we were on maneuvers, and we were best friends ever since. And so then, long story short, because I don't want this to be tedious. So then came back, finished at Juilliard. Every summer I'd do a movie. And then after my 4th year of Juilliard, I graduated. I did the only TV show at the time that was shooting in New York, which was the original Law and Order, the mothership.
Oh, classic. Yeah.
And so
Wow.
I did it season 2. I played a bad guy season 2. And that cast was Paul Sorvino and Chris Noth. It was the second, because the first year was George Zunza, who I loved from Deer Hunter, and
Wow.
Noth.
George Zunza.
George Zunza, right?
There's a name.
What-
That's going back.
What a great guy, right? And so I did that,
Yeah.
and so that was the only show there. And then I did I did a Broadway play. We did the first sort of U.S. or American revival of the Homecoming of the Pinter play. And then after that was done, I was like, well, I'm done. I've done everything in New York, and I went to L.A. And so I moved to L.A. because I wanted to have a change of pace. And it's funny because growing up in New York City, especially then, I mean, now once again, you don't have to live in LA or New York, but back then, if you were an American actor, you had to live in Los Angeles or New York, and they both said something about you. You know, I always thought, oh, I'm a New York actor because I started in the theater, but I got out to LA, and I remember, I'll tell you this funny story. This is the difference. I can put the difference between New York and LA in a nutshell. So when you'd audition, and like I said, I mostly only I auditioned in the summer. So it would be New York City in the summer. And you know what it's like in Baltimore, it's just like 100% humidity, 85 degrees. And you're walking by the time I've gotten those 4 long blocks, those long avenue blocks from the subway to wherever I was supposed to audition, my hair's already frizzed out. I'm soaked through. And you go into these tiny little rooms, and traditionally, many of the casting directors were less than forthcoming or kind, and you'd just be sitting there cramped. There'd be 4 chairs for 10 actors, and you'd just be listening to the other person's audition in the next room, and it was just miserable. And I remember the first time I went out to Los Angeles, I stayed at Tate Donovan's house, and I rented a car. So that's already like I'm in an air-conditioned car going to auditions. And I go to my first
That must felt
audition.
good.
Right? It just felt good. It's like you have your little air-conditioned office on wheels. And I go to my first audition in Beverly Hills, and it's a beautiful building. And I park my car. It's easy to park. And I walk in, and there's a receptionist there. And I go, oh, Reed Diamond. She goes, oh, Reed, we're so happy you're here. And I'm like, and would you like a bottle of water? And I'm like, I go, you're happy I'm here? Like, I mean, it was obviously, it's not, she didn't know who I was. I was just a name on the list, but I was like, oh, I can get used to this. This is awesome. Everyone's just a little bit nicer. And so I moved there, and, but soon after I moved there in the winter of '92. And also, like, when you land in January, and as you know, Susan, and the jasmine's blooming at night, and you're just like, wow, it's like paradise. And it was great, just because I'd lived the first 24 years of my life,
And the eucalyptus. That's what I remember. The
yeah,
eucalyptus trees.
and the jacaranda trees in May, all those purple flowers. It's something gorgeous about it. But I got to, and I'd done a bunch of things. I'd done a Hallmark movie with Jessica Lange, and a Willa Cather novel, Oh Pioneers, and I'd done a bunch of TV movies and the movie. But my goal was really, as per how we started this conversation, I was like, I'm going to be a film actor. I'm not going to act on television. I want to be a film actor. But then also, after I got there, it was a crazy time in LA. Within a month or 2 after I got there, the riots happened, and it just seemed like a really crazy, dangerous place. And then I had this, as I think many actors do, I had sort of an existential crisis. To be a little hyperbolic, I was like, what am I doing? I go, I'm playing pretend for a living. I want to do something real. And I'd always wanted to, I always thought about being a cop. And as we can talk about as it goes, my father's cousin was an arson detective in Seattle, and I'd spent some of my summers hanging out with him on his boat, and
That tracks of Homicide already.
exactly very Kellerman Finnerty, and
Wow.
and then because I was acting, I guess I was doing TV movies when I first got there, and I met there were a lot of cops who would work on shows, LAPD guys. So I befriended this one amazing cop, Ron, and I just told him, I think I want to join. He's like, okay. And so he took me to the police academy, and we spent the day at the police academy. And then he's like, do you want to go on a ride along? And I said, yeah. So he took me on a ride along down in Watts. And it was intense. It was
Quite a place to go for a ride.
it was a great, within, I wasn't in the car. So it was me and two, I guess, uniform cops. And then because I was a white guy in plain clothes, it just looked like everyone assumed I was a cop. And within, I don't know, we weren't in the car 30 minutes, and I saw my first dead body.
Ooh.
And
Wow. Yeah.
it was an overdose, but I went to my first, it was the first dead body that I hadn't seen in an open casket at a funeral's,
Sure.
at a relative's funeral. But what was interesting is all the cops I met, they all wanted to be actors, right? Everyone, when I went back to the station house at Watts, they're like, and I realized, as I knew in 3rd grade, right? I was born to be an actor. It's what I love. And so in that moment, I remember being in the police station in Watts outside one of the holding cells. And I go, I'm going to play a cop on television, and I'm going to play it truthfully. And so this is 1992, and I immersed myself in the world of Cops. So obviously there was the television show Cops, but there were a lot of great books. There were a bunch of books that came out about just little stories from, there was 2 books, the same series about Chicago cops. There was one about Boston cops. There was this famous book about New York City, the most decorated New York cop, called The Soul of, I think it's The Soul of a Cop. And interesting, that's for the Paul Raganese wrote it. And it's funny that Tom said that Yash got the idea of the Subway episode from Taxi Cab Confessions. He may believe that, but I told him that story because that's one of the main stories that happened to this cop in this book. And I remember sitting in Finnerty's office, and Yash was like, "Hey, did you have any ideas?" I'm like, "Well, you got to read this cop's story," because he was the most decorated. He was an emergency services cop, so they're sort of like the special forces of NYPD, and he'd done all these heroic things, but he was with this guy who got trapped in the subway, and they knew as soon as the subway was going to move, the person was going to die. So he arranged in the 80s to have a phone brought down there and all that stuff. But I think Yash legitimately forgot, because when he wrote it, I was like, I told you that story, but he didn't, But we were all big fans of cocktails back in the day on the Homicide show. So I think no foul there. But so I was preparing and preparing and preparing. But at the time, I remember I finally sort of made the decision financially. I was like, I better start doing television. But I was just playing boyfriends, and I hated it. And I remember going to my manager's office, and there was the head of the company, I think, and I won't say her name, but I go, I want to play a cop. She's like, "You're not going to play a cop. You have to do a lot more kissy face. No one's going to give you a gun. You're just going to do kissy face." And I'm like, "I don't want to do kissy face. I want to play a cop." And so then cut to, I'm literally, that's all I'm doing is preparing to play a cop for a couple of years. And I remember I'm sitting doing a very well written pilot. I'm doing a 2-hour pilot in Vancouver. Actually an amazing cast, and some of them who also appeared on Homicide. And I remember sitting in my room it wasn't the Sutton Place then, it was called the Le Meridian, but it became the famous Sutton Place in Vancouver. And I'm sitting in my room, and the first episode of Homicide airs. And I remember sitting there and watching it, and I go, I have to be on this show.
Yeah.
That's
the first episodes. You caught the first episode.
the first episode. And for me, because I was looking for the cop show that was real. And so to go, to backtrack a little bit, the movies that formed me were all of the Sidney Lumet movies, right?
Like Serpico
and Dog Day Afternoon, Prince of the City, where you had these realistic, gritty urban tales shot on location. And in fact, all my favorite movies are really that period of those great directors of the 70s, where you're on location, it's really happening, and they're telling truthful stories. And all those characters, all those actors, I remember there's a character actor who used to be in a bunch of Sidney Lumet movies, Jack Kehoe, and I'm like, oh, I want to be like him. And I really was inspired by these people in those stories. And then and as we got to which is so essential to Homicide, everything was shot on location in those gritty streets, and that makes a huge difference. But I remember watching the first episode, and Yaphet Kotto and Ned Beatty and John Polito were acting heroes of mine. Those were guys, because I always looked to the character actors. And Yaphet Kotto, I loved him so much. I know you worked on this movie, Susan, right? On the Star Chamber?
Yeah, Star Chamber. Yep,
Yeah.
when I was a trainee.
So he exactly. So he played a cop on that, and he was amazing in it.
He was amazing in it.
Which I told him on our which I'll tell you that story later. But and Ned Beatty, he was unassailable, and Polito, I was just such a huge Polito fan. And then there's Andre. And I just remember, I want to be on this show. I want to be on this show. So,
were you shocked when you saw Andre walk in, or did you know? Was that personal connection also a surprise when you saw him on Homicide?
No, I wasn't surprised, because he was a star. He should have been. It was. I was expecting, only great things from Andre, but I was like this. And then I remember, the handheldness of it, because the other thing too was, I remember when NYPD Blue came out, and forgive me, this is all good-natured disparaging, but I was like, I hated that show. And I thought, because I was like Fontana said, until Homicide occurred, Hill Street Blues was the show. And then the other show that I loved was his show, St. Elsewhere. I was like, these are real shows. And there were performances on St. Elsewhere that stuck with me forever. Stephen Morse, and it's just like there were performances on there that I never forgot. And that's to go back to, just for a moment, to what we talked about in the beginning. What you also have to understand is, because there was no basic cable, and there wasn't even really the HBOs and the Showtimes yet, in the 80s and the 90s, people were trying to make cutting edge dramas or comedies, but dramas, I can speak to a little more authoritatively on network television.
Mm.
And I always feel like the last attempt at that was West Wing. And then after that, there was no reason to do it there and then there's a reason, The Wire is my favorite show ever because it feels like the fulfillment of everything that we wanted to do on Homicide, but couldn't because of the language. And so I love that show backwards and forwards. But so anyway, so I see the pilot and I go, I have to be on that show. I have to be on that show. And so it was, I guess, around 2 years later, I get an audition for Homicide. And it was a brilliant scene.
I'm gonna jump in. Did you have any connection from working on Law and Order? Was Tom connected with that at all at that point? He
No,
wasn't,
I didn't
right?
know
No.
anybody.
Okay.
I didn't know. No, I didn't know any because when the year I did Law and Order was like a singular year where they had a different sort of producing staff, and then there was a regime change after that, so no, I didn't know Tom. But this audition came out, and it was a brilliant scene, and it was like a 2-page scene in the box. And Kellerman wasn't called Kellerman yet; he was called something else, which I wish it came to me. Someone will know. But and now here a little just piece of trivia about auditioning in the 90s. So everything that I went up for in the 90s when I was doing all the kissy face, because I was doing, I was doing all those TV movies. I was being Tori Spelling's boyfriend, or Kelly, I was Kelly Martin's boyfriend. I'd be like the boyfriend who you think is a bad boy, but he's a good boy or whatever, so I'm doing all those. And everything I auditioned for in the early 90s on the breakdowns, and the breakdowns are sort of the description of the character that the casting sends out. It would always say a Johnny Depp type. And now I wasn't a Johnny Depp type. And so oftentimes during pilot season, because that was the era of pilot season where you could have 4 auditions a day,
Huge.
right? And you're going from studio to studio and you're auditioning all the time.
Pilot season was huge.
It was huge. Yep. So I used to, my technique back then was I'd say to my reps, I'd just go, hey, if this is the first day they're seeing people, don't send me. I want to go after they've seen all the Johnny Depp types, because there were a lot. And I'll come in, and then maybe if they're willing to see an actor like me, who looks like me, because I was blonde, blue-eyed kid, and that strategy usually worked for me. But with the Homicide thing, I was just so excited. The scene was so good, and I go, I hope they want someone who looks like me. I don't know. And I remember, I'll never forget. So I went to NBC in Burbank, and there was a satellite office there where they did a lot of casting, somewhere on the campus there in Burbank. And I walked into that room, and every actor in that room today, like everyone wanted to be on that show. It was sort of like the Juilliard thing. I felt like I'd been preparing for 3 years. So I felt really confident. I wasn't confident that they would want someone who looked like me physically. And at the time, I'd just done this crazy movie with Stallone and Antonio Banderas called Assassins.
Oh, yeah.
Julianne Moore, right? And so I've done this crazy. Antonio Banderas was fantastic. And I've got funny Stallone stories we can talk about over a drink sometime. But I'd grown my hair very long because it was the 90s. So I had like the big sweeping 90s hair, and I'd grown a goatee, which
cool.
So I had this sort of look, a very grungy, but 90s look. And the audition went great, and I luckily got a callback, and the callback was in New York, and I happened to be in New York, and it was at Lou DiGiamo's office, and it was going to be with Tom and Barry. And Lou DiGiamo notably cast The Godfather, right? So that was really exciting.
Yeah.
So I was so excited.
Yeah, that's a name.
That's a name, right? And so I was just so excited. And they gave me an extra scene. So it was like it was an interrogation scene, it was a box scene, and then it was a scene where that woman drops her shirt in front of me which appeared, I think, in Fire Part 1, where she strips to try.
With her red kimono.
Right, she tries to seduce me. And I was just like so excited, so nervous. And I remember, I think there was one other actor there that day, but I went in, and Barry and Tom, and they were so lovely. They were so lovely. And I gave it, and then I went back out to the room, and I was like, oh, I think I could do better. And I was like, and I've never done this before, but I was like, hey guys, can I do it one more time? And they're like, sure, come on, do it one more time. Because I wanted it so bad. And lo and behold, I got it. Then began I can't even say the next chapter of my life. It began a whole another novel of my life.
Mm.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that scene because I was watching. I watched a bunch of episodes last night and this morning, including Fire Part 1 and 2, because
Right,
obviously that's when, you walk in and somebody says, "Detective who?" Right?
right,
Like, who is he?
right,
But that scene specifically, that scene with the woman across the street, you were interviewing her to see if she had witnessed anything and witnessed the fire. And she had shown up that morning and was sort of, inserting herself into the investigation the morning of the
right,
fire. But then when you go over, I think you go back the
right.
second time to
Yeah,
talk to her, and that's when she drops the kimono. And I remember thinking how nuanced that performance was, because you are obviously like, she drops her kimono and you're obviously like, I'm gonna look, right?
right,
I'm
right,
gonna look. But also I'm a professional and she's not gonna get over on me, and I'm not interested, and she's not gonna draw me in. But it really struck me the range you could see yourself thinking and the range of emotions going through you in that scene, because you also wanted to get what you wanted to get from
right.
her. You wanted to sort of placate her enough to maybe get some information, but not, not to cross the line with her. So it really struck me when when I watched it last night.
It's very kind of you to say
Good
because
good performance.
you're so sweet. Because when I watched that, the first two episodes is well. First of all, I want to pause this conversation for 1 second and
Yeah.
just say really clearly here
Mhm.
that I think the first thing we need to address is the writing on this show was so incredible,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Mm.
So like, we have a saying that if it's not on the page, it's not on the stage,
Yeah.
and so it ties into this scene. So to have these amazing scenes to audition with, where the writing is so subtle and so, as you said, nuanced, it was a gift. I mean, I will forever be grateful that I got to work with these incredible writers. I mean, Tom Fontana is a genius, and
Mm,
and
mhm.
and so because we didn't improvise anything, right? We weren't allowed to.
Mm.
The only
Mm.
improvise that I remember in the entire shooting that I did on that show was when the Kellerman brothers came because they couldn't control them. But I'll tell you that story later. But that scene, so it's funny that you say you say that scene was nuanced. So thank you. I mean, all I see is we're trying to find this guy's look, which they put too much makeup on me
Mm,
because we were trying to figure out all these things. So
oh,
I'll
interesting.
give you I'll give you a little sense of when we started this, when I said I only realized a few years ago that I don't think I was brought on for the reasons I thought I was brought on. In my mind, I'm like, I've been preparing for this part for 3 years. I know what it is to be a cop. And they wanted someone to do some kissy face. And so they'd written a scene where a woman gets all naked in front of
Mm.
me. And it's interesting. I mean, I could just say it now. I mean, poor Julie Martin, the amount of times I called her because they would write me these kissy face scenes or these romantic scenes. And every time they'd write them, the entire time I was there, I go, I don't want to do it. Let's not do that. I go, that's not Homicide. I go, let's do the Homicide version of what this scene would be. And so I go, no, I go, he can't have a good relationship. And also the other thing too was if you notice in retrospect, he had, so let me just say, they said we speak for the dead, right? They said that was their
Mm.
mantra in the writers'
Mhm.
room. My mantra for Mike Kellerman when it first showed up was he joined. I did this to make the world safer for kids and old ladies.
Mm.
So
Okay.
he
Yeah.
he was there every day to make the world a better place for kids and
Yeah.
old ladies, right? So
Yeah.
already he's too vulnerable. And so his downfall is sort of preordained in a certain way because he's too
Mhm.
sensitive for
Mm.
this job.
Mm.
And he's also, you even see it in Fire Part 2 with my ex-wife where he's just in love with her, right? And
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
always fight for love scenes. Jumping ahead in the motel episode in Full Moon, I
Yeah.
think
Great
Mhm.
episode.
they'd written this scene where the prostitute and I sort of like canoodle, where we make out or something like that. And luckily, Larry and Leslie Williams, Larry Williams, Leslie Libman were directing that. And I said, hey, I have a different idea for this scene. Hear me
Mm.
out. I go, wouldn't it be more interesting if he really connected with her, like he really liked her? So like, how about they have this conversation instead of like kissing and doing it? How about they're like sort of sitting next to each other, staring up at the stars? I just had this
Mhm.
image in my head.
Yeah. It's a great
And
scene, that scene.
and
Yeah.
it was, and so, and I know, and you know, it's funny because I realize now what a schmuck. I was frustrating them at every turn, right? Because they wanted me to do kissy face and be hot. And first of all, full confession, I've never seen myself as hot, and I certainly didn't see myself as hot then. So that wouldn't have even occurred to me. I was like, they got me here because they know that I'm a serious young actor. But
It's interesting
so
you say that because I watched that
yeah,
episode last night too,
right,
and that scene specifically, I remember thinking to myself, it was so Homicide
right,
because it became a
yeah,
philosophical discussion.
Yeah.
You know,
right,
Yeah, that's what the show's so good
it didn't
for,
go
isn't
to
it? Yeah.
it didn't go to the sex. It went to the
Yeah.
philosophical discussion, and it
Yeah.
gave her
Yeah.
room to be a person too.
yeah.
You know,
And that was important, like, because it was like, yeah, and they couldn't be props. They were had to be full characters, and I thought that's the Homicide version. Because NYPD
Mm.
Blue, sorry to, you know, I don't mean to defame them, but it's like, you know, you know, they show a little butt and they every once in a
Yeah.
while get a shit in, but like I didn't want to do that. I
Mm.
felt I felt such a responsibility to the Homicide brand, and I think that
Mm.
speaks to my arrival there because I will say this unequivocally. No one was very excited to see me show up when I showed up at the beginning of season 4, and not at
it's
all.
like who's the
And
Anybody in
blonde kid?
particular?
it
Yeah,
was no one was excited to see me.
who
And
is
now
the
I
blonde
realize
kid? Yeah,
who was the blonde kid. And I'll tell you some
Yes.
funny stories about this. But and I realized in retrospect, I was like, of course, they thought, oh, this guy's gonna ruin the show because you just lost Ned and Danny and John, and now I'm coming in, and they think that, you know, they think I'm gonna Melrose Place up the joint. And so it's funny because my first day of shooting, not shooting, my first day on set meeting
Mm.
everyone was my 28th birthday. So July
Oh, wow.
20th, 1995.
wow.
And the day started, you know, so, you know, it's a billion, you know, 100% humidity. We started with, we had to go meet somewhere in Baltimore because the mayor was going to give us like the key to the city, or it was like called Homicide Day or something like that. So I remember
Brilliant.
Henry Brummel, who I loved, and Tom, they're like, we're going to pick you up at the hotel. I think I was staying at Henderson's Wharf. We're going to pick you up and we're going to drive you downtown. We got to do this meeting. The mayor's going to give us the key to the city, and then we had to come back and do the galleries, do the photo
Mm.
shoots, because we always started each season with the photo shoots, which is a whole nother story. So I remember the cast was there. No one would talk to me. The only person who would talk to me was Belzer. And Belzer was like, "Oh man, welcome! We're so glad you're here." And you know, Belzer and I were friends ever since from that day. But he was the only one. But I was like, "Oh, this is great. This makes sense," because I was such an earnest young actor. I was like, "Oh no, they would never like the new guy coming to the squad. It'll be really hard for him." So I was like, "I can use this. I can use
Mm.
this." And I remember,
Right.
I still remember that first day of shooting. So we had to do the group shots, and
Yeah.
you know, if you've ever had to photograph the Homicide cast, you've been to Nam and back because
It's like herding cats.
so this, I guess, this will be the first time I start this theme that will run throughout the entire conversation, is like, so I worked with, these are the most talented people I've ever had the
Mm.
great good fortune to work with.
Mm.
Mm.
And they were powerful, intense motherfuckers, right? So there were some egos and intensity. So like, no one wanted to do the photo shoots. I mean, oh, they would just sit. People would be giving fuck you fingers doing it. And then the NBC photographer would catch that. He's like, please stop that. And, you know, and me, and I'm coming into this, oh, it was great. And then people would, I mean, how many times people would just walk off or like, we're done. And I am so young and so earnest. And I come from this like theater, like, oh, we're going to put on a show and like ensemble. And it was just insane. And right. So I just remember that first day, like Clark and I have to do these because we knew we were going to be, and they're going to make us partners. We had to do our photo shoot. I remember him looking at me like, you're not going to be here long. And I'm going to be here long. But you know, things changed. But those first 2 episodes were so amazing. You know what? I was so lucky to have such incredible introductory episodes, the Fire Part 1 and Part 2.
Yeah, those are really
and
dramatic and also just really visual, those episodes.
yeah, they're
A lot
beautiful.
of
And they
action.
were,
Yeah.
but it was strange because yeah, I'm trying to like I say like you welcomed me, Susan, and there were a few people who were friendly at first, like Tina, in costume designer, and everyone in the office. Everyone in the office was delightful. But I was like, okay, this is what it's gonna be like. I've got to earn my stripes, and because Andre was
What
was
I was gonna say,
cordial.
what about Andre? How, I mean, if you knew him, what was that like?
Well, it was funny because I was still like the first year student to him. He was like, "Oh, hello, I remember you," but he wasn't. No one was. Like I said, no one was excited to see me. And now in retrospect, I totally get it because they thought I was going to ruin the show. They didn't know that I had ulterior motives.
Well,
And
I'm gonna jump in and just ask.
yeah,
Early
yeah,
on in auditions for other things, you said not the sides, but whatever you said, always
The
said that
breakdown.
the
yeah,
breakdown. Yeah,
yeah.
always said they wanted a Johnny Depp type. Did you
Right.
have a sense? You said later, you knew they wanted you to do kissy face or to, add sex to the
Yeah.
show or whatever. But was there a sense what type they were looking for? Did it say that
No,
anything?
n- well,
Yeah.
I don't know because I think they said I think the breakdown for the homicide thing did probably say a Johnny Depp type. I really do, if I recall. But I think the other thing, also let's pause. Let's say one of the things that makes homicide so special is that cast. And it's so funny because nowadays there's such a sort of external push for diversity that is sort of imposed on a show. And that was the most diverse show. And it wasn't.
Mm,
It just was the best actors for the part. You've
Mhm.
got
yeah.
Yaphet Kotto playing a Sicilian, and to the credit to Barry and Tom to cast just the best actors for the parts, and it wasn't. It was a multiracial cast without being cynical about it. It just
Right.
was, and I think it's true. It's like we never even thought about it. Like that's how we all saw the world. We thought it was the Dr. King's dream, right? We're just content of your character, and so I love that. I mean, I love they always have Yaphet saying some Italian. I'll never forget him
Yeah,
saying
those are great.
I
Yeah.
love that.
just
I
watching him
love that
try to say
stuff.
risotto, like I remember it was the documentary one. He's like, and a nice risotto. And but it was like so the best actors were hired. So I'm sure they had a vision, and I'm sure NBC had a vision of who they want. Because I'm sure I was foisted, or the addition of the a kissy face character, I'm sure was foisted upon them by NBC. I mean, I'd love to. I've just reconnected with Tom. I'd love to talk to him about this, but yeah, so it was fine. It was chilly. It was chilly at first, but it quickly warmed up. I mean, I think it's funny you say that scene with my ex-wife, or not my ex-wife, with the woman who exposed herself. I can just see it's funny going back and watching all these episodes yesterday. The hardest thing about being an actor is you have to rehearse in public, and I had to find that character in front of everyone on set, because I'm also the kind of actor I prepare, but it really, until I'm in the clothes, in the situation with the other players, I have to find it physically and emotionally and tactily. And there were so many there were competing ideas of like who I was supposed to be, how I was supposed to look, because originally Tom wanted me in jeans. And then I remember this is all like this first day, like he wanted me in jeans, and then like, no, Gary, Diodario, or like, our tech advisor, the amazing D, Gary D, he's like, he can't wear jeans. No one on the force can wear jeans. And he, and I couldn't have the goatee. And they were like, should we keep his hair long, cut his hair? Like the hair sagas never ended. I never had good hair that entire time, And so we were trying to find his look. And it's funny because they were because he liked fishing, so they gave me like a fishing tie, and then these like weird clothes. We didn't find my look. The people who actually found my look were Larry and Leslie when we did the motel episode, which I think we shot earlier than it aired, and they were so visual and so cool, and they came up with this look that became Kellerman's look, which was more of a 40s look, where I had solid color shirts and ties and went with it, and sort of these 40s cut suits, or early 50s cut suits. And so they found it, and that was great, because we were sort of like shooting in the dark, and I'm just trying to be good. I was just and doing it in front of in front of everybody.
And how much
uh
did that sort of anxiety and trying to find yourself really hooked into, here you're playing a character who has anxiety, who's trying to find his way in this established, hardcore homicide unit. Did it work like that, or does that not really work, like,
It
in real
totally
life
worked.
as an
That's such a
actor?
No, it totally worked. That's such a smart question. That's a really great question because it's exactly how it worked. And I was such a keener that I go, oh, this is perfect. Like all of this will feed me, and this is what Mike would be going through, and this insecurity. And in fact, my favorite scene of all of those first two episodes, and the one where I felt it landed as to who he truly was or is, was the scene with my dad at the
Mhm.
distillery. And because he didn't have to put the bravado on in that scene, and it shows him emotionally as he truly is. I can see his end there. I can see that he's too sensitive for this job, um, and too earnest. And that was just a magical scene. But also, having done that scene, I never drank well liquor again. As you see that those bottles are being filled by like garden hoses, and then it turned out I have a friend who's like, "Oh yeah, my family used to own that place." I mean, and all it was like this horrible rot gut coming out of these giant
Oh.
vats through garden hoses, and then there were just stacks of labels because
Mm.
that would be the vodka, Lord Baltimore vodka, or if they sent it to the PX at some
Mm.
military institution, it would
Mhm.
be their vodka. So it was terrifying. So I never drank well liquor again
So,
after that.
and that scene actually, because I
Yeah.
just watched the episodes too. Um, that scene was interesting because you understand why we're seeing that.
Yeah.
You're going back there to get sort of a boost from him or to understand what you should be doing with your life. And also, I thought it was interesting in the full moon episode where you talk about would I do my life over again? And that's like way before the Luther Mahoney shooting
Yeah.
and the corruption trial and the whole thing. But there was a real um uh look in that scene with your father. I think it was just the
Hmm.
last beat. There's like an extra beat
Exactly.
on the end where you look at the totality of what your father is and what he's doing. And there's
Yeah.
this extra beat of that look of like, and I really don't want to end up here. So
Exactly.
you sort of
Yeah.
see your mind sort of click over into, okay, I really need to go back and do what I'm supposed to be doing, as a detective.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was yeah, you nailed it. And also, this also brings up the subject of music because also the music on the show was so important, and Tom was so good at picking it. And there was sort of this Mike Kellerman theme song, that live song "I Alone," that swells up where
Mhm.
he's where, and it really, that sort of, I never I listened to that song repeatedly after that because it sort of got me right into the mood. And that was one of the coolest things about the show was the music. And if I'm sure you remember, right? Tom would always give us cassette tapes at
Yes.
Christmas
I still
of,
have
Really?
those
That's cool.
somewhere.
yeah,
Yes.
they're so magical. I still have them too, right?
Great. They were like the best mixtapes ever because they had
The
such a
best.
wide range of interesting
Were
music
they all
on them.
personalized tapes too, or like a generic one?
No,
Or?
it was the one it was the music that he'd used that season in the show.
Mhm.
Ah,
And,
got
Yeah.
you, got you.
but
Yeah.
they just they were so tasty. Like I remember, like we had that
Mm.
beat down. They played like super bomb bomb, super bomb bomb. Like there was so many cool, there's so many cool action or sequences in that show that are inextricably aligned with the music that he chose. And
Yeah.
he has such incredible
And
taste.
and talking about the music at the end of the scene with your dad, I just also watched Have a Conscience, and the
Mm,
scene where right
yeah,
after you're about to shoot yourself, and you and Clark are walking down the pier, and the music comes up, and it put the period on the sentence. The
yeah,
music,
Mm.
really drew out even more emotionality from that scene.
right.
Yeah.
Just as you're walking away, and it was a sort of like I don't remember the lyrics, or something like I don't want to be alone, or I'm going to be together with you, or it was something where it underlined your partnership with Meldrick, and that how important that was, and to stay there, and to be together and be alive.
Yeah. Here's the thing. That show was art. And
Mm.
also, but they weren't doing 10 episodes or 6 episodes. They had to do 22. I mean, the writing
Yeah.
was
Yeah. Not easy.
incredible, but just the filmmaking, which we'll get into in depth, but the music was key. And it was great to hear Tom sort of dispel the myth, because we all heard, I mean, I even heard Simon talk about it, David Simon talk about, like, that we couldn't, the reason it doesn't stream, because everyone wants it to stream, is because of the music. But then he's saying that, no, it's true. So I do hope it's out there. I mean, it's amazing
Yeah,
how,
apparently there's some movement now
Yeah,
on moving ahead with the streaming. So fingers crossed.
that would be
That's
great.
going to
Mm.
happen. So Chris, do you want to jump in? I know Chris, one of the questions you had, I think you had seen somewhere was an anecdote read about your first experience with Yaphet.
Well,
Yes.
yeah,
So
that was a really good story. That one. Yeah, do talk to us about
I
Yaphet meeting
definitely
him for
want
the
to
first
talk
time.
about this. So this is great. It's perfect because it came up in these episodes, in the fire
Yeah.
episodes. So like, Yaphet is a trip, right? And so as I said before, I was such a huge Yaphet Kotto fan. And so, I'm getting to meet everybody. And in fact, I love our scene that, we have together. I always loved all of my scenes with him. There was a great dynamic. And but I didn't know the man well yet. But within 2 seconds of meeting him, we're in the box I guess he's going to offer me the job. And I just said, Mr. Kotto, I just have to tell you, you are my favorite James Bond villain of all time.
Hey.
And he just lights up. And then I just start going through his resume. And I go, you in the Star Chamber. I mean, it's inspired me across
Star Chamber.
110th Street. And so we hit it off really well. Now knowing that the man had a ego befitting his humongousness, because the man had hands bigger than my head, like he was giant. So we hit it off, but Yaphet was a trip. So I mean, I can tell you some Yaphet stories, but let me tie one into talking about shooting the show. So shooting the show was amazing, and I want to really get into this about Jean and Boots and you but obviously, just as we know, there was no traditional coverage, right? So we're just, everyone's going where they're going. There's no marks. You find the scene. There was no close-ups. Yaphet always wanted a close-up, and he had like 3 great techniques for always getting them. And I would watch because the thing, as I said, like, this was such a crucible for me, this entire experience. Like, I'm learning. This is where I learned how to act on television. I was really, up until the show, I really considered myself only a theater actor. I wasn't comfortable in front of the camera. And so this was my school, and it was great to do it handheld and great to do it with Jean and do it in that way where marks weren't important and there was a lot more freedom. But Yaphet had these great techniques for getting a close-up. Now, the number one, if you're in the box, and you'll see this all the time, he would go and look out the window. So there's that little square window. And so if he does half the scene out the window, you have to turn around and shoot him through the window. So he'd get a close up that way. He'd he'd go to the mirror and do the same thing and talk into the one-way, two-way mirror, whatever the heck it is. Or, as you see all the time, he would just start walking. He would walk away from you. And so then the camera, he had to be the point of the spear then. So the camera would get right on his face.
Yeah.
And then the other one, which I saw him do, I think in this episode, he wouldn't know his lines. Now, sometimes he just legitimately didn't know his lines, but sometimes he wouldn't know his lines. So they were going to have to, like, for his part of the scene, we didn't get it. We didn't get it in the group shots. And then lo and behold, they'd do a single on him and he'd be word perfect. And I was like, wow. I learned a lot from a lot of people on this show about like what not to do, what to do. I saw a lot of very bad behavior that was very successful, but he was a genius at getting a close up. And one day I made him so mad because I finally was like, it was probably my 3rd season there, like season 6 or whatever like that. And I was just so tired of him just like walking away so he could get the close up, and you had to follow him. And so we're shooting the scene. It's probably like Alex was probably shooting at this point. And he starts walking away. And as he's walking, I just walk to my desk and get on the phone. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, I mean, you're walking that way. I'm just going to go this way. This is where Mike would go. And he couldn't because he was so used to it working all the time. But no, I loved Yaphet so much. Do you remember, Susan, when he had his Nation of Islam bodyguard on set?
I heard you mention that on something I listened to the other night, and I do not remember that.
Because
I thought about it a long time, but it didn't spring to mind.
Because one of the apocryphal stories that I heard, because I would, like, as I say, I would collect all the stories of the bad old days before I got there, because I was such a fan of the show, and Clark had all the stories. So Clark or Jimmy Finnerty would tell me all the stories of what happened before I got there. But I think one of the stories was like, I think Tom might have told me this, and it's fine. This is a sweet, sweet story. But Yaphet called Tom and said, "Hey, you've got to get NBC to get me some security because the FBI is going through my trash and the CIA is bugging my phone." Right? And he's like, "Yaphet, I can't get you. NBC's not going to pay for your security." So then he had. But what was so funny is we had this Nation of. I really remember him being there primarily during the documentary episode, but like literally like right out of like out of frame, just standing there in case anyone tried to assassinate Yaphet. But my favorite part was every morning he would go into Yaphet's trailer to check for bombs. But one thing that people probably don't know about this show is we didn't have dedicated trailers. We only had triple bangers. We had these, we may have moved up to double bangers later once we got that 2-year pickup. But like so you didn't know that if you were going to plant a bomb, you were just as likely to kill Max Perlich as you were Yaphet Kotto at that point, because no one had an assigned trailer until like 5 minutes before they got there. So
It sounds like a great episode already.
it was really fun. But anyway, I loved Yaphet, and it's funny. I mean, I was, like I said, I was such a fan. I was like, one of those where you're pitching yourself, like you're in a scene with Yaphet Kotto, and he was hilarious. Sometimes he was unintentionally hilarious. And one of my favorite things is Clark and I, because the greatest thing that happened to me on the show was that Clark and I became partners. And, because as I was saying, like I was trying to find myself when I first arrived, and I didn't really find myself until Clark and I got partnered up. And he and I just aesthetically, acting wise, and then also like our vision of who these cops were, we aligned. And he used to tell a story of, because we knew that cops only talked through gallows humor, and they would never, if they had to say something sincere, it would have to be through some sort of ribald joke, and no one was going to speak directly. And so we had that. So we were able to have, because I felt like Meldrick and Kellerman had this really intimate relationship, but like very rarely would topics be addressed directly. And it was nice too, because we got to be sort of the antithesis of Bayless and Pembleton, because they were very serious and very philosophical, and we would have more fun, and we got to do fun stuff. But also he told I think it was like a Jay Lansman. It was a story from some of the original guys from the book, the original, the real Homicide Squad in Baltimore. And they're like, oh, I love, Detective blah, blah, blah. Cause when he's taking me from behind, he always, he plays with my hair, and it's just, he's so sweet. Those things that you say where you can't say it directly, and you say those things. And I loved all that, cause that's how cops talk. It's bad jokes, it's gallows humor. And so I was very fortunate to, Clark and I just had an easy chemistry. It's so much fun to watch us just be in the cars, just talking, and I'm finding out about like, he's not consummating his marriage, all those things, and caring about him and loving him. But also he and I together, like sometimes Yaphet would just, he would say some crazy shit in the scene. Like he wouldn't know his lines, or he'd say them weird. And then Clark and I would just be giggling like schoolboys in G's office, because we were always trying to stay in the moment. So we always played it, because obviously that was one of the amazing things about the show was you were always on camera, and everyone was there for each other. So we were like, if G was really saying these things where he's garbling the word and pushing through the intersection, we're going to laugh, and he would get so mad at us. But, I figured, Clark had my back. He could protect me.
I was just going to quickly ask if you'd met any of the actual detectives from the book when you're on the show.
So the book's really important to talk about too, right? Because David Simon's book is a masterpiece, right? And as I said, I'd gone to cop college prior to showing up on this show, and that was one of the books I read. And I still, for years after, anytime I played a cop on a TV show, I would reread that book as my preparation, because there was nothing like it. I'm such a huge David Simon fan, and I loved that book, because as a person, as I say, I was devouring all these books, but nothing had captured it that way. A year on the killing streets
really
with these
amazing,
guys.
amazing piece of work. Yeah.
It's an amazing piece of work, and it's and it's all right there. And we'll talk about how important Baltimore and unique Baltimore is, but it was such a special book. So obviously, the first person who I met was Gary D. Gary Diodario, who's G basically in the book, right?
How did G and D get on?
They got along great. I mean, Gary was really cool because, they seemed to get along great. But I mean, Gary D really was. He was one of the early people who was very nice to me, because I was a huge fan. And he wanted to be. Gary really wanted to be involved, right? Like he wanted to be on the show. He wanted in. So I think he's also enjoyed how friendly and outgoing I was to him. But I really would always ask him, especially as I was trying to figure out each case, I go, hey, what would you do right here? Like, what would you do if you showed up, if you rolled up here, like, what would your first move? He was like, well, I'd probably like sketch the body, or get like with the position of the body, or I'd probably look at it from here. I'm like, okay, great. So for early on, I used him exclusively. I'd be like, hey, Gary, what would you do right now? And he'd tell me. I'm like, and I just do it, because I was like, this is the real deal.
What a great resource to have right there, right? It
Oh,
was
he was
great to have him
amazing.
on the set.
Yeah. He was so cool, right? And I love Gary, and I'd hang out with Gary all the time, and then it was great when Gary had to act too, because he'd be like the head of the SWAT force, right?
Right.
And he'd be all nervous but very excited, and I'm like, you're the real deal. We're just a bunch of pretenders. Come on, man. But I love Gary, and he helped me a million. I mean, every once in a while the guys would stop by. Like I think like Jay Landsman stopped by, because I remember that was also one of the cool things as a fan of the book and the story, watching The Wire and seeing those real guys show up. Because that brings up another point, Susan. Because I remember when I showed up, the Baltimore accent's very, it's very particular,
Yeah,
and no one did
I
it.
saw a little clip of you doing a Baltimore accent online somewhere, and I thought, well, he did not do that in the show. Did it take you a
No.
while to learn it, or did you decide you weren't going to do it?
Well, because you spend time there. Hey, you guys, what you doing?
right.
Going to get
And
a
you can do a
Coke.
little
And it was
bit
like,
of it without overdoing it. But you
but
didn't
but
use
they
that.
didn't.
You didn't use that
They
in the Kellerman character.
no, they
So
didn't
you
want
had
it.
oh, interesting. Okay, and
They
it would have
didn't
been
want it.
too what alienating or something.
Well, I think it's a funny thing, because I mean, this is important to talk about. Like Baltimore is an incredibly unique city, right? And it has this, but unless you've been there, that accent would sound very strange. I mean, it was very cool on The Wire that
Yes.
like Dominic West did it, and I think he did it perfectly. Melissa was doing it a little bit. She and I talked about this a lot, and
Yeah, she did. She did a little taste of it. Yeah.
she did a
Mhm.
taste of it, but they
Mhm.
didn't want it, because it's unless you
Mm.
know it. Now they did it. The one that takes place in Pennsylvania, and murdered, or my daughter's got murdered at the Wawa.
Yeah, see, the
Like
Philly accent's very similar, a little
very
differences,
similar.
but yeah.
But they didn't want it. So, and I thought, like,
Hmm.
for me, it seemed like everyone was doing their version. Clark was doing Phil. He was doing his version of urban. I just leaned into my New York a lot more, because I
Right.
thought, like, especially at that point, because of like the City Limit movies and those kinds of things, your sense of like an urban gritty cop really was sort of that New York accent. So that's what we did. I mean, you obviously had guest people come in who had Baltimore accents, and it's such a cool, fun accent, but we didn't do it because they didn't want it.
Interesting. You did it pretty good
Yeah.
on that clip I heard the other day, though.
Well,
So
tried, yeah.
it's not
Because it was
easy
gonna be great, because it's like another world. It's a whole
is.
nother world.
I actually taught Tom Hanks how to speak with a Baltimore accent. So there you go.
That's brilliant.
Well, there you go.
And it is it takes a while for people that aren't from here to get it right, and people that try to and don't get it right, it's really sort of falls flat.
Yeah, you don't.
So
Yeah. You want to
interesting
get that right.
yeah,
Yeah.
interesting that they didn't want to go there. I understand that. Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Quick process
Yeah,
question, because
yeah,
I'm
go for it.
Mr. trying to be a director and obsessed with process and work of actors. I mean, like, what was sort of like a typical day like for you on Homicide? I'm always interested about, like, because you had a lot of pages to film, and as an actor, kind of going through all that, and sort of trying to kind of capture nuances of the character without over necessarily rushing it. And I'm just fascinated by all that.
Yeah, the process was, I mean, obviously the scripts were spectacular, right? The scripts were spectacular. And here's another thing that was unique to Homicide, and I've literally never had it again in my entire career. So we all had mailboxes in the office, and everyone who worked in the office was delightful. It was, I still Kathy Kurtz had above her desk, a lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on mine. I've never forgotten that.
Oh,
It's
I
like
like
my
that.
favorite quote ever.
That's a good one.
You know,
Yeah.
and then Finnerty's office, where we all spent many hours. But we all had these mailboxes. And on the day you started shooting an episode, the next episode's script was in your mailbox. I've never had that before. So you had a week to prepare. You had and I think we shot 8-day episodes. But and it was so funny, because this is before cell phones, anything like that. I was so excited when the next script came out that I would literally go into the stairs in the back of the office, like where the copy machine was, and I would furiously read the script, because something maybe you don't know, everything was top secret. No one knew what was going to happen to your character. People would try to get information. I remember Melissa was dogged in trying to find out what your arc was going to be
Interesting.
on that show. Because here's the other thing. Like I say, it was an ensemble of incredibly talented actors. Arguably Andre, I would say, was the lead of the show. But the rest of us, we were people were fighting for storylines, right? Everyone wanted a juicy storyline. And I could remember how competitive it would be. And people were really gunning for stuff, and they'd get pissed off if you got something good or they didn't. And I remember when I first got there, like, I remember Melissa Pepperme's like, hey, has Tom told you anything? And I was like, hey, he told me a little bit. And he's like, don't tell her what I told you. Like, it was like, everyone was like, that's top secret. So I had like a little inkling of what was going to happen. So for then I kept mum about everything, but I was so excited to read the next script and find out what's going to happen on the show and what was going to happen to my character. I would sit there in the office and read those episodes. And I can't tell you how many times, because we didn't have cell phones, but there was a phone right there on the landing, on the stairs. I would call the writer's office to say how excited and thank you.
Oh.
I would call Tom. I'm like, oh, thank you for giving me, this is so amazing. I'm so excited to do this. I remember calling David Simon when the Luther Mahoney shooting episode came, because here's another thing that made Homicide unique and didn't happen on network television. I thanked him so much. I was like, oh my God, you've just thrown me into the most gray, morally ambivalent area. And that's the most Homicide thing I could think of. And I love it. I was like, thank you, man. But on a network television show, your leads don't do morally ambivalent or ambiguous things, right? Your good guys are your good guys, and your bad guys are your bad guys. And that's another thing that made this show so special and so unique on
Those
television.
story arcs were amazing.
The story arcs. Yeah. So, and it was such a gift, because as an actor, I don't know, the kind of actor that I am or aspire to be and continue to aspire to be, like, I like it gritty. I like it. I'm a Chekhov fan. I don't want it all spelled out, right? I want to know that I want the layers, and it was always there. But I would furiously read those things. So you talk about process. So anyway, so we'd have the scripts to prepare. Everyone was prepared. And then we would show up. Now, the other thing that made the show unique was you had directors you knew, but then you had directors who had never directed a second of television.
Right. And he might only be there once. I mean, we had the people that were back 6 and 8 times, but there were directors that were only there once. Yeah.
And I remember my first year, the sort of newbie directors would sort of pick me out in the lunchroom where we're having lunch, because I seemed like the least scary person to talk to, and I definitely was. I was the least scary cast member. So I remember Whit Stillman coming up, and Whit Stillman had directed Metropolitan Red or Barcelona and all those, and he was
young
and he, which was so cool that all these people were coming in, and we can talk about all the fun directors. But I remember he's like, hey, Reed, do you have any advice? And I was like, yes, I do. I have some advice. I go, when you step on that set on Monday morning or whatever it is, and because I knew it was like a scene with Melissa and Yaphet, I go, don't tell them where to go. Ask them where they want to go. Don't say like, you enter from here, like you just, and I go, if you do that, you make Melissa and Yaphet feel heard, everything's going to go fine. And I remember I'm in that scene,
right?
And he steps on set. He's like, all right, Melissa, you coming from here, Yaphet? And boom, boom, I hear 2 doors slam, and those fuckers are down in their trailers. and like, it took like 2 hours to get them back up. And I was like, dude, I told you one thing. You had one thing to do. Don't block the scene until you ask the actors what they want to do. But, for me, it wasn't really like that. It was, I mean, that was funny. There were a lot of people who, not a lot of people, there were a few people, the 2 I mentioned, who often, if they were upset, would leave. And I'd just be standing there with the crew and like, oh, I guess we'll see what happens. And Jimmy'd come and someone would have to be talked to and brought back up. But with Clark, no, I mean, for most of the stuff, like, it was just sort of, it was so natural the way we blocked it. And we, as you said, like, Susan, I love that, talking about like, no one showed up at like crew call and got your stuff unpacked. Everyone was ready to go. And, and it felt that it was really exciting, and the fast pacedness of it, I loved. And I just loved, I mean, the handheld was gorgeous. There's also, if I want to like slam NYPD Blue one more time, like, we literally were handheld trying not to be handheld. And they, that's when they started putting like the little bobble on the fucking camera, and it made me nuts. I'm like, we're not trying to do that. Right. But it was so exciting and natural. I just always remember it feeling, for them, I just remember the blocking portion being really natural. You'd have all these really good actors, if it was seen with a bunch of us, Andre had good ideas, and Kyle, we'd all just sort of, we'd feel it. And also, here's the other thing that's so special about this show is there were no sets, right? So the squad room, is a squad room. It's not, it's not, we're not on stage. So your desk is where your desk is, and so you're acting in a real space. And then the rest of the time, we're really in it. And I can't tell you what a difference that makes for the verisimilitude, but also just the naturalness of it. So it was so exciting to be on the streets or in the crack house or walking along the harbor. The blocking sort of often took care of itself, unless it was something very technical, a stunt or a shooting. And then John was just so natural. And it was so, you talked about what it was like to dance around the camera, and you asked about that. And that was essential to it because it created a different energy. And I loved it because I'll tell you, when you do traditional coverage, people just check out for your takes often, or they upstage you if they go last. There's a lot of, and I always believe, like I said, like I'm an earnest little ensemble player. I'm like, hey man, we all boats rise together. I'm gonna be great for your off camera. We're all just gonna like make the scene better than anyone could have imagined. But with keeping it so alive like that, it was just always exciting.
Yeah, and there was no off camera, right? I mean, you said
There was no
earlier
off
that
camera.
you said
No.
earlier there weren't any close-ups, so there weren't any setups as close-ups, but the idea that the camera constantly moved and could push in at any time for like a super close-up.
Oh yeah.
And you as an actor don't know. You don't know if, at what beat of your dialogue there's going to be a camera that may be at the moment across the room, and all of a sudden
Right.
John is on
Yeah.
you and pushing into you because he knows, there's a dramatic beat there that he wants to capture. So yeah, it was, yeah, must have been interesting. Yeah, for you guys. Cause like Tom said, you had to stay on your toes because who
You
knew
had to
when
stay on
John
your
said that?
toes. Well, John too, and he even mentioned it. My favorite thing was watching him because he was able to keep his other eye open.
Right.
So he would do this thing. He would do this thing where he's got one eye, in the optic or the lens, whatever you call it. I'm
Eyepiece.
eyepiece. Thank you very much. And then his other eye was open, looking for shit. And I was like, how do you even do this? But like I say, and I've said this a billion times, the hardest job on that show was Boots.
Oh God,
Because
absolutely.
I don't know how he did it, because
I don't
Boots
either.
didn't have a monitor. He had he was pulling focus. Boots was our focus puller, the amazing focus puller. And he'd pull that focus. He'd make little wax pencil marks on there, but he never knew where Jean was going to point the camera and he keep that thing sharp. I'd always be like, oh my God. And Boots, and I just remember Boots is like sweating and getting his measuring tape out. But but that was really exciting to have Jean finding stuff and in the moment, and it was an amazing space to play in. So that process was really exciting as an actor, because as I think Tom articulated this, that no one had a chance to get bored. Like there's nothing worse than sitting in your trailer for 9 hours, right? Like I like being on set, I like doing it. And as you said, Susan, we shot 365 no matter what the weather was, right? So there were some, you were in the rain, you were in the snow, you were soaked through, every once in a while you'd remember that the dead body on the street was actually a human and maybe get him up, in January.
Yes.
Because you've seen people turn blue. But I love the pace of it. I also loved having Jean as a co-player in the scene, right? So he was an amazing director. So when he started directing, it was so easy to work with him and so much fun. But also just knowing that he's looking out and he's finding the good bits. And it just gave, and I remember Tom had articulated the philosophy of the show was, on other shows, the actors move. And I hate that. The actors have to move to create energy in the scene. I mean, it's the Law and Order, cliche of who's going to stack boxes when a homicide detective is asking you questions, right? You're going to, if a homicide detective has a question for you, like that, this may be the most important interrogation of your life, you're going to stop what you're doing. But they always try to keep on network TV, often when you're doing a show, they try to have the actor move to put energy into the scene. And he's like, no, I'm going to move the camera so the actors can stand still. And that's cutting edge too, right? Like that's, and the fact that we shot in 16, that wasn't necessarily what TV was going for.
No,
So,
it wasn't.
but that's also from, we felt like we were making an independent movie every week.
Yeah.
Right. And that was so exciting. That was the only place I wanted to be. Now, the only thing that was hard about the pace, I was just thinking about this as I saw so many, I've forgotten how many people I was like, oh my God, I did a scene with you, like actors I love. And I was like, my God, we did a scene. because we moved so fast, the second you were done with a scene, you had to go on to the next one. So there wasn't there often wasn't time if an actor was in one scene where you could be like, hey man, oh, let's get together, or they'd be on the train back to New York or whatever, right? So that was the only thing where you couldn't be like, oh, I love doing that with you, thanks man. You had to like sort of get your head on, game on, and move on to the next scene. But as you said so articulately, Susan, like we did 12-hour days, right? Which is also unheard of. And no one will forget, Jimmy Finnerty coming down and tapping his watch. And you knew that we were
I
going to be
spotted a
done.
reference to that in an episode the other day where
Oh, yeah.
Yaphet comes out,
Yeah,
says
He did
like,
that one. I just watched that
taps his
one.
watch, have a heart.
He
That's-
tapped
I've heard
his
this
watch. No,
story.
have a conscience. He
Have a
tapped his
conscience,
watch and
that's it,
said,
have a conscience.
Exactly.
conscience,
It's
yeah.
brilliant.
Have a conscience. No, there's it. Right. Because that's the one too. Is that one too where he says to me, like, that's the one where he's like, there's a haiku of red and black and you've upset the balance on the board.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, oh, the writing. Here's the other thing too, that, I can never stop talking about how great the writing was. But it's also, it didn't occur to me as much until I rewatched these episodes. There's a lot of prose, but there's a lot of verse. There's a lot of poetry in the writing that I guess
And
I was
rhythm,
aware
a
of.
lot of rhythm
A lot of rhythm
in the dialogue.
and that was John's direction always, like faster, funnier.
But it's interesting.
Press and
you
surge,
said
just take out the pauses.
The sort of in jokes like the tapping the watch and saying have a conscience. And one of the episodes where I guess it was the beginning of the fire episode where Richard Belzer and Melissa Leo are on the upstairs on the top of the wreck pier outside and they see the smoke. But before that, I think it's in that
Right.
episode, they're talking about why Danny Baldwin and Ned Beatty aren't on the show anymore because they were caught with their pants down basically at the policeman's convention. But one of them says, and they were suspended for 22 weeks. And I never got that joke before. And they're like, 22 weeks? Like, why would you pick 22 weeks? And it obviously was a reference to the fact that they were not going to be on the show that year.
Season, yeah.
Exactly.
They were not going to be there for 22 episodes.
Exactly.
And then I think the throwaway line was something like, well, they don't know what they're doing, or something like that. That was a reference to to the number of episodes and whether we were going to be picked up or whatever. But that was fun. That was funny.
There's another funny Yaphet story in that fire story. Yaphet had a specific hair system for the first few seasons of the show. And in those fire episodes, he was going to go natural. So Tom wrote in all these things, which now you see that don't quite make sense in the fire episode. We're like, gee, have you lost weight? Something's different about you. But when he arrived in Baltimore, he got off the plane with his new hair system. And he said to Tom famously, like, Tom, it's a miracle. My hair's grown back. And it was a good system for the rest of the show.
I have a quick question to circle back. Not that I should circle back because we're a lot of stuff to talk about.
Okay.
But when you mentioned that the actors didn't know when we're talking about process, you guys didn't know your storyline ahead of time. Because when
Yeah.
I was watching some of the episodes last night and thinking about you specifically, because we were going to talk to you today, and the episodes that lead up to the Mahoney shooting, where obviously your psychology and your emotion about him just keeps getting ramped up and ramped up and ramped up, so that by the time you get, into his penthouse apartment and he has a gun on Clark, he's taking Clark's gun and he has a gun on
Right.
Clark.
Right.
It makes so much sense that he's just like, I'm done with you, pal. I mean,
Oh yeah.
because of the buildup of the emotions.
Yeah.
Did you have any? And I was trying to watch in the earlier episodes. I was wondering if you knew, like in the episode, the same episode, but where everything falls apart and Luther shoots one of his henchmen, in Druid Lake Park.
Right.
If you knew what that was going to lead up to, and I guess at that point it was the same episode. But did you, if you didn't, let me make this really complicated. If you didn't know the future storyline, did you have any sense that that was going to happen because of the sort of ramping up of not just his emotionality about it, but that whole thing talking about, when Luther has the Korean grocery store owner murdered,
Right.
and in
Right.
all the speeches about honor, which also reflect how you feel about your job and how you feel about
Right.
your dad.
Right.
Did any of that telegraph to you that something was going to break between not some other character and Luther, but specifically between you and Luther?
No, it's I mean, the writing was genius, and I was thinking about this yesterday. You know, obviously, as we said, I came here under false pretenses, right? I was here to be the hunky, kissy face guy, and in fact, I went from, they wrote that monologue for me in the first, or part two, like "Fun is my
Mm.
god," and then quickly things shifted, and in the genius of that writing, they so piled stuff on. So I knew at the beginning of season 5, right, that there was going to be this arson investigation. I thought, this is great, but because one of my most favorite episodes was the first Luther episode in season 4. Like I said, was that Damage Done, right? And I think so, right? And that was really cool, where things were starting to break and he was getting frustrated, and then with the arson thing just piling on. And then like I said, when David, because Simon wrote the episode where I shoot Luther, and I was just like, thank you, but it was a total surprise, and I couldn't believe they gave it to me. And I knew we'd opened up a can of worms that we actually couldn't write ourselves out of. And that's how, Tom and I agreed to sort of give him a transition out, because it was, but I was like, this is a gift. And that's also what I loved about the show, is the risks they were willing to take. And sometimes things didn't work, right? Sometimes you throw something against the wall and maybe it didn't pan out. But look, Mike Kellerman is the greatest character I've ever had the great good fortune to portray. And I love that things just kept getting heaped upon him. And then that journey was inevitable and feels like it was preordained. It's funny, talking about how people were concerned that I think I was going to destroy the show when I showed up. The Baltimore Sun, when the fire episodes aired, was particularly unhappy with my arrival. And I remember they wrote, I'll never forget, because you never forget your bad reviews. They referred to me as the thick-necked Reed Diamond. And I kid you not. And there was a cartoon, a caricature of the cast, and everyone else looked like themselves, and they drew me like I was like Moose from the Archie comics, like some 300-pound defensive, football player. And I was like, and I go, and now in retrospect, I get, oh yeah, you thought I was going to ruin your show. And then cut to, by the end, this character, because no one knew, no one had planned when I showed up that Kellerman's going to have this arc. But then, because of the marriage of their genius with sort of my intentions and my sort of persistence to not do kissy face, we got into this character, had this journey that no one could foresee. And then I remember, to bookend it, when I left the show, because Andre and I left at the same time, where he takes me into the box and I have to resign the force and blah, blah, blah. It's the Baltimore Sun wrote like a glowing, like multiple-page spread on how Kellerman was one of the most interesting characters on television. The show might never be the same. And I'm like, you fuckers hated me when I showed up. And but I love that, because that's the thing. That's, no one knows. And the aliveness of that show was, as I'm sure other people have noted. I mean, obviously, if things were going on in your personal life throughout the show, they might find their way into the scripts, right?
Ooh, okay.
And so certainly that happened with Danny going through a divorce, his character. So, there's things like that would happen in your personal life that would find their way into the scripts. Or sometimes people would have things, as like Kyle was pursuing Buddhism, or I know he pitched those ideas, like, hey, wouldn't it be neat if my character did that? And they were open to that. I never pitched anything, and I was very grateful. And still to this day, so grateful that the trials of Kellerman, they weren't fun, right? It was just amazing. I mean, but they weren't fun for him. They were fun for me to play. And it was, and like I say, I'd be like, thank you for allowing me to do this.
Yeah.
One, I suppose, other processy kind of thing. So
Yeah.
you would talk about the days are 12-hour days, and it's in 8 days block. But I think you have the weekends off. Is that right?
Correct,
How's that
yeah.
kind of work?
Sort of.
Sort of,
Well,
yeah.
I got to jump in there as a crew member.
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
you had the weekend off, but you might have worked until,
Oh, yeah.
like
Oh, yeah.
2
Crazy o'clock or
o'clock in
something.
the morning or 4
Yeah.
o'clock in the morning into Saturday.
Oh no!
So
Oh,
then,
man.
you really maybe had, a half a day Saturday where you were coherent. And then Sunday you're
Exactly.
Oh,
trying to
Oh,
do
bless.
your
yeah.
laundry and do
It
get
was
your
a wash.
groceries.
Oh, yeah.
Because what would happen, and the reason why that happened was you would start Monday with day work. So Monday you'd come in
Exactly.
at 7 a.m. and you'd have day work. And
Mm.
but usually by Wednesday, the call would go from somewhere like 7 a.m. on Monday. By Wednesday, it might be 1 p.m. And then by Friday, it might be 4 p.m., or 5 p.m.
Right.
So then you're working and you definitely are working into your Saturday. But obviously,
Yeah.
it's a cop show and people get killed at night. And so,
Mm.
it had to have a lot of night work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we did
Mm.
have weekends off, but they were truncated weekends.
Yeah.
Well, how do you so with that kind of schedule, how do you A, not get ill, and B, how do you sort of maintain your energy levels? Because
You
I'm
do get
Oh,
ill.
yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
Chris, I got so ill. So this is where like ill, like, so the thing about being an actor is I always say this, like, unless you're trapped underneath the vehicle, you have to show up to work, right? Oh my God. I think it was, I would say, yeah, The Damage Done, right? That's the first Luther Mahoney one, right? The
Yeah.
Jorge wrote. I was so sick, I should have been in a hospital.
Oh, shit.
And I remember, and I was just like, I got to go to work. And so you did, oh God, you just brought up another memory. I mean, I was so sick. Like I got conjunctivitis, everything was going
no.
wrong. And I was just like, and then we're out there in the rain and it's
Mm.
it's cold and
Yeah.
but you're just
Really
like, you
cold.
just do it. At one point, I lived down in Fells Point. So this
Mm.
has to be the first season because I moved away after because we can talk about the triangle of drinking, go studio, 10th Street Coopers, then home. But yeah, so I finally, but the first year I was walking my dog and I sprained my ankle. And the next day I was walking my dog and I sprained the other ankle. So I had
Oh,
two
no.
sprained ankles and they'd given me a pair of like Doc Marten boots and I just remember lacing the shit out of them and as tight as they could be. And I
Yeah.
was like, yeah, you got to go to work. And I had to run. I ran in them with two sprained ankles.
Oh.
So it was, there was no rest. There was no days off. You couldn't be sick. You just were sick and people were sick all the time.
Yeah.
We just, that crew crud would just go around
Crew
and you'd
crud.
pass it from one person to the next.
Yeah, and the thing
that-
about being a crew member that is a little different from being an actor because they're not going to replace you if you're sick one day. But as a crew member,
Right.
like we were all freelance
yeah.
people. We were not
Sure.
quote unquote full time, studio employees. We were freelancers. So, there was always the fear if I'm sick, they're going to make a phone call and they're going to
Right.
bring in
Oh my
another
God,
camera
of
assistant
course.
or another grip
Yeah.
or another electrician. And you don't want somebody doing your job that
No.
might end
Yeah.
up staying, so it often was, the you didn't want to take a day off, but also you also didn't want that responsibility. You didn't want to call your your crew leader and say,
Mm.
you got to replace me tomorrow, because then that becomes a burden on them. Then they're on the phone
Yeah.
trying to get somebody for the next morning while you're still trying to work. So it definitely, yeah, that's one thing about the film business. I don't know if the outside world understands, is that you really felt like you could not stay
No.
home when you got sick. You really
Yeah.
felt like you
Mm.
couldn't.
And I think too, talking about process and the endurance race. The other thing is, I keep saying this was a 22 episode series, so you were there for 9 months out of the year. And I always remember, Susan, I'm curious what you think. By the time you got to the last 2 months, everyone was pretty just
Bonkers.
destroyed. And it could be, and things would go, bad behavior would definitely skyrocket, and emotions and tempers were frayed by the end, and you were just holding on. And it's interesting too, because sometimes it would be the most tantalizing episodes would come near the end, and you just had to like find another gear to get in there. But we were so lucky to do it, that, I mean, there was, I guess some people gave up, but it was, but I just remember there would be like, when you get to episode 20, it was pretty ugly.
Yeah, because it was like super burnout. I mean, you
Super
really super
burnout.
burnout, drink like lots of caffeine, lots of
Oh,
bad
yeah.
food.
Oh my
Um,
God.
Yeah, it's just to
I
try
would
to
get those
stay.
remember those crazy frozen drinks from the Daily Grind, Susan? There was like, it had
Yes.
like 4 shots of espresso cream. It had all these like
Granita.
sugar. Yeah,
They were
granita.
called
Thank you. Yeah, the
granita.
granitas. There you go. Oh my God. I was
Frozen
just like,
coffee. They were amazing.
So is this the Baltimore delicacy that kept you going then?
oh, it was essential, but they were very expensive, and none of
Yeah.
us were highly paid. And I remember I'd have like a limit, like I can only have 4 granitas a day, and but they were so good in the Daily Grind. That was our daytime haunt, and then of course 10th Street Coopers was our nighttime haunt.
Yeah.
But yeah, those granitas kept you going. Because you start out a bushy tailed, except that was, like I said, it was, you'd come there in July, the end of July, and it was just 100% humidity and miserable, and you had to do these photo shoots. But everyone was rested, hopefully, by the time you got back. But then yeah, we'd wear down, but we made great episodes.
Yeah.
I mean, the crew was exceptional. I mean, this is a good moment to talk about it. I mean, this is everyone was so good and so happy to be there, and we were. After everyone knew I wasn't going to ruin the show, I got along great with everybody, and because I remember even people on the crew like, nah, this guy's going to ruin the show. But and the drivers and Ford and just it was just a really tight little group, and everyone was so skilled and definitely the best crew I've ever worked with, right? It was just everyone, and people were obviously getting opportunities. Maybe everyone was bumping up a little bit, and it was. Didn't we have that day where people changed their jobs or bumped up one? Susan, did that happen? Like where you got to
Wow, that
bump up a
doesn't ring a
level?
bell.
Oh, I feel like
That
that's
doesn't
happened. I
ring a
can't
bell.
remember. I don't remember, but
We'll have to ask somebody else. We'll have to ask that. We'll ask when we get. I'm hoping to get Frank and some of the ADs on.
yeah,
We could
definitely.
ask them.
But the schedule was grueling, but by having 12-hour days, that's huge because that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, every show I'm on, you're doing 20-hour days, and
Wow. How do you maintain your
Yeah.
energy level with that then? The 20-hour day is
It's so
insane.
dangerous.
it's
Yeah.
stupid, and it shouldn't be like because what happened was at some point in the early 2000s they just dropped a day off all the schedules, and then somehow on the books, the corporate books. I mean, whatever. I'm talking out my butt, but I've been told that it looks better to do multiple overtimes than have an extra day on the show, but it was diminishing returns, and we always got the work. It was we always got such incredible shots, and obviously John was talking about like holding that camera, Alex holding the camera. I mean, that's intense. But we knew we were making something special, so despite everything, everyone was always excited.
Yeah.
And I think too, like, let's talk about Baltimore for a second.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Baltimore's so special, right? Like, that's also to have made a TV show on location. That wasn't happening, right?
No.
And there's nothing like being there on the streets of just this exceptional, unique city. You can't do that on the New York lot at Fox, right? It's just not the same, or downtown LA. It just doesn't feel the same. And Baltimore is a character on the show, right? And Baltimore it benefited in some way, right? It benefited from not, doing well economically at some point. So the highway didn't come through Fells Point, and you kept all of these incredible, this architecture. I mean, there's no other city in the world or in a city in the United States that looks like Baltimore. And there's so much great architecture. So my first season there, they gave you a small stipend. You had to find a house quickly, and I found a beautiful row house just 3 blocks over, like on Bond Street, the other side of Broadway, from the 1700s. A row house from the 1700s, right there, wood, and I got an amazing rent, and it was just gorgeous. And there was so much cool architecture, and that character was essential to the show.
Yeah.
And people have talked about too. Obviously, the cast was amazing. The guest cast was amazing. The local guest cast was amazing. Pat was incredible
Pat
casting
was
director.
amazing. Yeah. Amazing.
But the other thing that was really unique and really made the show special was our background. All the guys in the squad room, they were there all the time. They were the same guys. So our background were permanent. So we all knew each other. We were all friends. We all hung out together. And it gave it that level of, they had characters. They knew who they were. For me as an actor, the thing that will take me out of a shot immediately is if the background's not in the same scene as the actors. And I always, as an actor, want to include the background and bring them into the scene. And we just had, and sometimes they get lines and they'd bump up, but they were just there every day. So you really felt like you at all times, because you were there. If the squad room was a real place, and when you were on location, you were in the crack house or you were running down that alley, and you were really there.
And even like when they added a set, remember when they added the workout room?
Yes,
You
I
know,
love the
people
workout
would
room.
actually go in there and work out. I mean, so, and
Yeah, it was a real room.
I wish I could remember his name. I think it was one of the background extras. Oh gosh, I wish I could remember his name. Taught me how to use the speed bag in there. So I know
Right.
how to use a speed bag now because one of the extras,
Hey,
one of the
that's
cop
cool.
extras, you know, would be in there working out.
Oh yeah,
And
some of my most favorite scenes on the show
yeah.
were in the workout room.
Mhm.
And then we went to the bank for a little while.
Even though it was a
Mm.
built, you know, it was a built set, everything was permanent. I think somebody mentioned
Yeah.
this in one of the earlier episodes. You know, on a normal soundstage where you build sets, you can fly everything out. The walls go out, the
Exactly.
ceilings go out, everything moves. And so that at some point you're shooting with an exposed, obviously the viewers don't see it, but the crew and the cast, especially who are working in this environment, see off the set, right? They see that it's not real because
Exactly.
you've flown a wall out. Well, we did that didn't exist on Homicide. So even though it was a built set inside of the banquet room, you know, in the rec pier upstairs, which you were talking earlier about, I think something I watched the other day where you talked about having visited that and gone up in the banquet room, which is now this
Exactly.
incredibly beautiful space. But
Exactly.
even though it was a built set, nothing moved. So it felt absolutely real. It didn't feel
Yeah.
fake. It didn't look fake. You know, kudos to the set dressers, the set designer Vince Perenio and his people.
Yeah. Vince is a
That
genius. Yeah.
stuff did not look like a television set ever.
Mm-mm.
Nothing in that
No.
show ever looked like
No.
a set.
Yeah, no, and so then, you know, because for me, you know, with acting, you're trying to make it as real as possible. So the less things you have to pretend and make up, the better. And so that squad room, we knew we were a desk, as you said. I stayed there. I stayed now at the Pendry Hotel, which the pier has turned into, right? My
I
friend,
can't afford to
who I-
stay there either. You mentioned that. It was something I
Oh,
was
dude, I can't afford to
the
stay
other
there. My
day.
buddy, who's Dr. Kim
Beautiful,
Hammond
though.
from Falls Road Animal Hospital, he
Beautiful.
put me up. He said, "You got to stay
that's
there."
where I take my
Oh, bless.
cats.
Oh yeah, so I met.
Sure, I know him.
he's-
He's treated my cats before. Oh, I didn't know you
Well,
knew him.
he's
Funny.
he's the best. I got him I got him a
Aw.
background in a scene because we became friends while I was shooting there, and we've been best
That's
friends
so
ever since. But he's like, "You
So
got to
funny.
stay there, and you got to take your family
It's
there."
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was crazy though, because I'm having breakfast with my wife and my daughter, and I'm going, "This is where our trailers were." You know, we're downstairs in the garage, and then I walked into the banquet room, as you said, and I go, "That's where my desk was. There was Clark's desk. That's where the board was. Someone was having like a wedding rehearsal in there, but it was just wild to go back and walk up the stairs with this, you know, the stairs where we'd always have the barn father
stairs.
scenes on those stairs. And it was just wild to be back and see how much has stayed the same. So it was really lovely to stay there. Yes, I can't afford there. So thank you. Thank you.
And also so cool, like you said, that that they restored the building, that the building still exists, that it's still
Yeah.
there. It could very
Yeah.
easily, and in many
Of
other
course.
cities, could very easily, even before Homicide was shot, have been destroyed because it sat there for many years empty. And
Yeah.
unused. So the fact that it was saved, you know, kudos to the city and to whoever the Pendry people are for doing that, for keeping it. But we have to get that plaque back up. Somebody said that they took the plaque down that says this is where the show Homicide was shot.
Yeah, I heard that.
That's a bummer.
to go-
I took a
to go
picture of
look
that
for that.
plaque. Yeah, they better
Yeah,
put
so
that
I
plaque
don't
back up. Come on, man.
And apparently the Homicide board's in a bar somewhere. I don't know if that's still the case, but I was
Yeah,
reading
had
that
you
over
heard
Christmas.
that,
Yes.
Reed? And not like not the waterfront, or well, we got kicked out of the waterfront, but not Cooper's. I think it's somewhere else. Do you know where it is?
Yeah, someone told me where it was. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
I think because there were sales, obviously, afterward. You could go buy props and wardrobe and that kind of thing.
So exciting.
I guess some
Yeah.
people picked up some stuff. So funny.
It's funny because we were, you know, talking about the unique period of time we were in and how unusual the show was. The other thing that it was the sort of beginning of internet communities. And we had an internet community. Basically, at the time, there was an X-Files community and there was a Homicide community. I remember I used to lurk on it because you want to see, like, did they like me? Did they like what I did in that show? And then I remember once I saw that they were going to have like a little convention or they were all going to get together at the waterfront. And I saw the date and I was like, I'm going to show up. And so I showed up and there was like, 10 people who've come to, from this online Homicide community. And hey, do you want to see the sets? And like, yeah. So I took them up and showed them the board
Oh,
and
great.
got
So
pictures
cool.
with all of them in front of the board. It was pretty fun.
Yeah, we used to have
That's
a
so
lot of
cool.
tourists come by, and there
Yeah.
also was somebody in
Mm.
town that did homicide tours that would
Oh,
take
Yeah, I
wow.
read
people
about
to,
that. Yeah.
take people drive, I guess, in a bus to the locations where I get, some of the more famous scenes or shootings or,
Oh, that's
or
neat. Yeah, makes
episodes.
sense. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Well, what about after Homicide? You've been working with Clark Johnson. He's directed you on a few things like The Shield,
Hmm.
SWAT. I think my memory of you in SWAT was you were a vegan cop. There was some joke about you eating
Exactly.
some
Soy dog.
tofu. Yeah, that's it. I remember that now. What was that like working with him beyond
Well,
Homicide?
yeah. So let's, Clark, I love Clark backwards and forwards, right? And as I said earlier, when we became partners, that's when I sort of found my legs
Yeah.
100%. And also, I also feel when he directed, that really changed
Mm.
things too, because he's such a
Mm.
great director, and everyone loved him, right? And if you remember, he did that those Christmas videos, because he always had his Bolex camera with him, right? He was always filming
Oh, I didn't
stuff.
know that. That's cool.
Yeah, and so he was a great director because I can see it too. I was just watching one of the episodes that I think it was Map of the Heart, and where like the Lunch Bandit episodes, where I'm trying to find the guy who's stealing my lunch.
I remember this now.
And I
Yeah,
remember at the time, I think I was like, "Oh, Andre's got the serious thing to do. I'm doing the Lunch Bandit," but I'm like, "Oh, thank God I did the Lunch Bandit. It was the best." And there's some scene in the gym that you're talking about with me and Melissa, and I'm showing her how to throw a punch. But you could see that Clark's directing, because you can see all the actors are just a little more comfortable and a little more playful, and he brought that out. I really felt like I found the character even more when he directed, and then I was able to sort of carry that through, because he knew what we were capable of. He had such a great sensibility, and he was so fun, so loved. I mean, the famous Clark Johnson thing that he would do, he'd announce on set, "Hey, today's my birthday," and everyone would buy him drinks. He's like, it wasn't his birthday, right? They'd buy him drinks that night. I mean, he was a jokester, and he was such an amazing guy, right? He was an incredible father. His daughters, Mika and Cassandra, were always there, and he was such a good dad. But also once he got over, once he realized I wasn't there to destroy his show, we became really good friends and hung out a lot. It was sort of me and Bells and Clark. That was the majority of my group with the cast, and we do a lot of things together. And Bells took really good care of me, and so did Henry Brummel and his wife Trish, and
nice.
Finnerty. I mean, Finnerty. If it wasn't for Finnerty, because he early on, he got all the fishing stuff inserted into the show, but then he would take me deep sea fishing, and I'd catch tunas, and I'd spend nights out on the
Use a
boat with him.
right? The boat,
Yeah,
right?
it was
I
really
forgot about
special,
that.
and yeah, because he was
And
he was such a
Joni, right, on the
amazing
boat.
Joni,
Yeah.
exactly, right, exactly. And we'd be out there, and she'd just be. They were the most incongruous couple, and so in love with each other. It was
Yep.
fantastic, right?
Yep.
And then he was just one of
cute.
those guys where I wanted to make Jimmy Finnerty happy, and he was just he'd seen it all. You knew he had your back, but also he wasn't going to put up with any bullshit. But yeah, working with Clark. So on the show, we really formed a strong bond, and I fell in love with him. And in fact, at a certain point, I think it was very difficult to disassociate myself from the character as it went on, and I had a hard time when Meldrick and joined with Stivers and sort of abandoned Kellerman, and I, in a weird way, I thought, I didn't buy it, right? Not that I didn't buy it, I didn't want to buy it. I was like, I thought he would have been loyal to me, but it was incredibly painful. And then we didn't get to work together that much on the sixth season, because it broke up the partnership, which was cool, because then it gave me the opportunity to work with Belzer, who I love. And so we got to do Kaddish, and we got to do the stuff at the
that's a
Camden
good one.
Yards, and Belzer. I mean, talk about heroes. I got when I was a teenager, Belzer's book on how to be a stand-up comedian, and I have it in hardcover still.
Oh, cool.
Wow.
And that guy was just,
No,
he
he
was
hadn't.
so smart and so funny and so unique. And that's funny. I'll tell you just a little anecdote too. Before, this is a Clark anecdote about finding the character. So because Belzer had such a clear character, his conspiracy stuff, which was what he was interested in, and I'm glad that got incorporated in the show. And I learned so much political things that I still quote to this day. I learned from Richard Belzer. Like, he's such a smart guy, right? But
Right,
anyway,
yeah.
so early on, I'm trying to find my character, and I haven't found him yet. I'm trying things, and I can see, like I say, in Fire, I can see the scenes that land, and I can see the scenes where I'm really trying to get there. And Andre and I had gone to school together, and we both trained at the same place. And I remember watching Andre, and I go, he articulates each word, and he gets the last consonant in there, and I was like, I can do that. We had the same training. And I remember I'm in a scene with Clark, and I said something like, "Get against the wall." I did it like, and Clark's like, what the fuck are you doing, man? And I was like, I go, I know, I just wanted to try. It's like, yeah, don't do that. He's like, you know what you're doing, just do your thing.
that.
And
Exactly.
it was really important. He's like, just do your thing. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I thought if I was like more like Andre, I'd get like more Andre stuff to do. But he quickly disabused me of that. But then
So funny.
working with him as a director afterwards was so great. So the Shield thing was really interesting because after Homicide, it was a hard experience in many ways. In that, like, it was an intense experience creatively and on set and with the personalities. And then my personal life was just, I was young. I started at 28. I grew up a lot on that show. And like what I say, like why I didn't sleep last night, I didn't figure things out then, but the questions that came up and the struggles that I went through and the things that I learned about myself sort of propelled me on to the next stage of my life. So it's not a job. It was a place where I grew up as a man and grew up as an actor. And there were things, it's interesting, part of me was like, oh, all actors do this, but I go, I wish I could go back and I wish I could have done this, but it couldn't have gone any other way. It had to be that way. And so it was an intense place. And there was a lot of, like I said, there was huge egos and very intense people because everyone was so talented. But there was a degree of, I'm going to try to find the exact right word for this. It wasn't chaos. It was an intentional.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
It was
chaos.
controlled chaos.
It was controlled chaos, and it was intentional. And I always heard, I think Tom might have even told me this one night, that he liked the prickliness of it, that it made a better show, that people, but by the tensions amongst the actors themselves and there were two camps between the writers and the actors, and there was always, for lack of a better word, there was a fomented sort of us versus them dynamic that happened in those years. And obviously, prior to me getting there was some really intense stuff going on with actors. And I learned, because I was a collector of the stories, basically no one from NBC was coming out. So as long as the episode got handed in time, it didn't matter that you couldn't find an actor for a week. If you could find him, wherever he was hiding out, and you could get a scene shot, NBC was none the wiser. But I remember, and as we said, we talked about the triangle of work all day, go across, drink all night, everyone drank together, and then go home, rinse, repeat. And I can't tell you how many times.
There was
and dance.
dancing happening too.
And there was wrestling. Do you remember the wrestling, Susan? Because I can't tell you.
I remember one crew
Who was
member in
wrestling?
particular that at a certain alcohol level would begin to wrestle people. Yes,
There
I'm
was a
not gonna
lot
name
of
names though.
Well, I can't tell you how many times, like, Yash would, at a certain point, Yash would challenge me to wrestle. And like, we'd be on the floor of Cooper's just rolling around in stale beer. And that was part of, like, and I loved it. And it was prickly and it was crispy. And I like that. We were talking off camera, we were talking about some directors from the old school, Chris and Susan and I were talking about. But what I liked about that show, as I said, like, no one was like, hey, welcome, kumbaya, welcome to the show. Like, it was intense and like, you better prove yourself. And I like that. And because it did create a really good dynamic. I remember, and I tell the story affectionately all the time. Tom Fontana, if I had to do an emotional scene or a big scene, he'd walk right before we'd shoot it. He'd just walk by. He's like, don't fuck it up. and I loved it because it was that competitiveness, because he said it out of affection. Like, if he was worried that I was going to mess it up, he wouldn't have said that. He knew I could handle it, but it got me like to another level, right? I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to show you, and I liked it because it was sort of that, the dynamic that you might have in a squad of homicide detectives. So when I go to do The Shield, so Clark is directing the pilot of The Shield, Michael Chiklis, Kenny and Wade and what was that was the beginning of FX, right? So it was going to be FX's first show. This is the beginning now of prestige basic cable. And after Homicide, the experience for me was pretty intense, and I didn't want to do a series again. I just kind of wanted to do theater. And it took me a while to sort of find my way again. And it was interesting because I got offered a bunch of shows when I left the show, and I just like, nah, I'm not gonna do it, schmuck. But it was like, but anyway, so when he's like, hey, do you want to be in the pilot of The Shield? And spoiler alert, it was a long time ago. So if you haven't seen it, I'm just gonna break it to you. But we're gonna make it seem like you're gonna be regular on the show, and then the lead, Michael Chiklis, defining his character, a morally ambivalent character, he's gonna shoot you at the end of the pilot. And I was like, so excited. I was so excited. I was like, oh, I get to be on the show, get to work with my buddy Clark, who's just the most amazing director. And then I don't have to be on the show. And I remember being with those guys. So this shows the difference. And this was like the beginning of my growing up, because I learned a lot of, not bad habits aren't the right word, there were a lot, like I said, there were a lot of very strong personalities, and there was some behavior where I thought, like, to survive, I thought I had to emulate some of that bad behavior, and not bad behavior, but like I have to stand up for myself in the way that other people were standing up for themselves. And I realized at the end of it, I go, no, that's not who I am. Like I am just a nice guy, and I can't compete at that level. I tried to be an asshole, or I tried to be, I tried to use some of those tricks to whatever it was for the power dynamics. But I was like, at the end of the day, like, you either are that or you aren't that, and you can do it and you can't do it. And I learned powerful lessons. But anyway, so when I worked with Clark, but I remember being on the set of The Shield, and the scripts were great and the cast was amazing. But I was like, oh, you guys all get along. You're going to fail. Because I thought that I took to heart that, no, that's the magic. The magic was that it was tense, and there were divisions, and it wasn't safe, and I thought that was the recipe for success. And I go, sorry guys, because you all love each other, you're all super supportive, you're very nice to me. And then it was awesome, and I was like, oh. And that's when, like, on the next step of my journey, I was like, oh, it doesn't have to be crazy, it can be sweet and supportive, and you can still make a cutting edge show. And that sort of took me on to the next iteration of my career. But it was the magic of Homicide, right? And those intense personalities, and whatever the fomented divisions.
I think it all kept the performances always at the top, right? It kept
did.
this energy. It kept the energy in the actors and in the crew. Because
So well
not just
said.
because of the fast pace, but interesting, because I didn't know, you don't pay a whole lot of attention to what's happening between the actors when you're just humping your equipment around and trying to stay up, stay on top of everything. But that's
Yeah.
interesting. If there was, little bits of that conflict, but that keeps the edge on it and keeps everybody's performances right at the top, right?
Yeah. No, wait. And it worked. I mean, it was, like I say, I've never had a creative experience of that level. And it formed me as an actor, and I learned everything. I learned how to act on camera on that show. And I learned a lot about myself as a person, as I say, and how to navigate some of these situations. And I wish I could have. You can't learn something until you've learned it. And so I had to learn. Like I say, I've never learned anything from the success. I've only learned, but I've had a fuckload of failures. And so, like, I tried things that didn't work, and then I was like, okay, that's maybe not who you are, how you want to approach that situation in the future. And it was an important crucible. And like I say, the most creative. A character that I don't know if I'll ever be fortunate enough to play something that's as meaningful and powerful as Mike Kellerman, with that level of talent and writing.
Yeah.
And to Tom's talent, when I left, it was, he called me up, at the end of the season, we're getting near the end of the season 6, and he's like, what do you want to do? And I just said, and I was really protective of Mike, and I just said, hey, I think we can't have him at his desk for another year. And I think just to protect the integrity of this character, I think I have to go. And he goes, okay. But he's like, is it okay if I don't kill you? And I said, absolutely, absolutely. Right. Which was great. And it was such a gift. And it's interesting. It's happened to me a couple of times where I've left a show, and it created an opportunity in the writing that transcended anything we could have gotten if that actor had to stay or that character had stayed, because this opened up a thing. Because then suddenly, if I'm gonna leave, then he gets to write this scene with me and Andre in the box, and that's powerful. And then because he didn't kill me, because he had the fourth slide, he got to bring me back as PI in
Right.
the last season, which was, that's my, if I have one part, that I always want to play, for me, like the sexiest thing in the American oeuvre is the PI. And I'm a Rockford fan in and out, and Raymond Chandler. And so that was such a gift, and that was amazing to come
Yeah,
back
and,
and do
and
it.
so interesting that after that amazing story arc that you had, that all of a sudden there's a whole other thing happening, right? That
Yeah.
you were gone, but then you come back, and even within that, couple episodes, there's a story arc with you, and you're sort of
Yeah.
disgruntled, but you still have that sort of cop honor thing going on, and then by the end, you've won back at least some of the respect of the detectives,
Yeah,
because you
that's
helped them
right.
with with their investigation. So
Right.
yeah, really, just really amazing.
And
Yeah.
and the movie as well.
Oh yeah, the movie. I always forget about the movie.
Mm.
The movie was great because that was the opportunity. Because the thing I most remember, and that's what's interesting going back and watching these shows, and probably why I didn't sleep, because it was so many memories, and I don't remember scenes I've shot. But then when you see them, like, oh, you usually remember the life things. And for me, the movie, the most exciting part was getting to have lunch with Ned, right? Because I hadn't gotten to meet Ned. And so I got to hang out with Ned and talk to him, and that was just really like a dream come true. And then that was the first time I met Giancarlo, because we had all of our stuff together, and I had wonderful conversations with him. And funny that I remember to this day. And then when I met up with him again on Better Call Saul, we were rehashing all of that. But yeah, the movie was just great to have everyone back together. And then Polito. I didn't meet Polito until I met him in the Dublin airport as I was coming home from getting married. My wife and I got married in Ireland.
Oh,
And
brilliant.
I'm at the Aer Lingus, like first class lounge or wherever we were. No, I guess we were just waiting at the gate in Dublin airport. And there's Polito. He's on my flight too. He just shot a movie there in Dublin. He's going on his way back to LA. And I'm like, John, he's like, Reed. And I learned, and we never met each other, but we knew who each other was. And I learned so much from him in just like an hour in the airport and 14 hours on that plane. We get on the first class, like, ladies and gentlemen, let's toast the married couple. It's like, and he was, but he did this great thing because he taught me this thing that I'll never forget. We're in the Dublin airport, and as a character actor like myself, people sometimes recognize you, but they don't really know who you are. And people came up to, and before this moment with Polito, people were like, hey, did we go to high school together? No, we didn't go to high school together. Or, I would be like sort of coy or demure. And I watched him, and someone would be like, he's like, you know me from this. And someone else would come like, you know me from this. And I was like, oh, that's genius. He just gets in front of it. Ever since that, it's how I do it. Like, you know me from this. And they're like, oh, I do know you from that. I don't play coy. I'm like, yeah, I'm on TV. You know me from this. And so I was glad I got to meet him, because he was an acting hero of mine, and he did not disappoint.
What was it like coming back and meeting up with Giancarlo on Better Call Saul? Because that's such a great scene you guys have. I can't remember if it's 2 scenes or 1, but I just remember that sequence. It was really good.
It was an incredible scene. That's a beautifully written show, and that was just one of those where I wanted to be on it. It was funny because when we showed up for the rehearsal, it's like a 6-page scene, and I do most of the yapping, and he was sort of, I remember we said hello to each other, and I was like, hey, good to see you, man. He was sort of, he didn't register perhaps that he knew me, and I don't have a big enough ego that I think, oh, he should remember me. That was a long time ago. I hadn't seen him since 1999. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. He don't remember me. And we did the scene, and we rehearsed the scene, went great. And the next thing I know, I'm in my trailer, I hear boom, 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 boom. He's knocking on the door. He's like, Reed. He's like, I'm so sorry. Like, and we just like spent 2 hours just gabbing in my trailer. And it was great because he's such a sweet guy, and I'm such a huge fan of his. I mean, even go back to like his Broadway stuff and his teenagers, and Merrily We Roll Along and Seesaw. And so he was like, so it was really great to see him. And it's great to see everyone. I don't know if we talked about this on air, but it was, I was working with Jean 2 months ago, and it was just like we'd never left. And I don't even know if I've seen him since the movie. And then working with Alex Yashevsky on Bosch. And it's just when you see when you're working with those people, it's like I said, you've been through something so special together, and you have a shorthand and a confidence in each other. And working with Clark, the last time he and I, we did SWAT together, we did SHIELD together, which was amazing. And then he came and directed an episode of a series I was doing, The Purge on TV. And it was just so great to see him. And immediately he's just we're just playing around, having fun. And then he and I took these shots. We mimicked our season 5 press photos together. We just did the contemporary version of them. I put him out as like a diptych. But and it's good. And I'm in touch with his kids, and you know, it's really special. And I was in touch with Belzer, and like I say, whenever I'd see Kyle, it was just so warm and sweet. I'd run into him in LA. We'd be at yoga together or whatever it was. So it's always good. I mean, you know, obviously it's really sad, right, to lose Andre, and
Yafet
and Yafet and
Richard,
Belzer, and I do
And
think,
Richard,
and Rich. I mean, like, it's just like I guess I held out hope, or not the hope. I had the desire. I was hoping we could all maybe just do something together, or at least all get together. But it would have been also like, because those characters had such legs, and obviously Belzer Munch is the only character, right, to ever be on 4 different shows, right? So I was at the freaking dinner where he asked Ed Sheeran, when they were doing the hot crossover, he's like, "You should put me on Law and Order." I was there, and I remember going,
really?
I'm thinking, it's me and
That's
Belzer and Ed
funny.
Sheeran and Jane Alexander, his wife, and they were doing the crossover episode. And I'm sitting there, and I'm the only cast people who were there is me and Belzer, and Harley's there. And he's like, "You should put me on Law and Order." And I was like, "Look at the balls on this guy." And then cut to he did it. I'm like, why didn't I ask to get put on that show too?
You need a PI on that
A
show.
whole other career, right?
He's a genius.
He is.
But yeah, it would have been nice to all get together. And now, you know, I don't know, but there you go.
Did you ever go to his house in France?
I freaking didn't. And I heard Tom went, and you know, Clark was there all the time. And it was funny. Bells was like, "You got to come over. You got to come over." I'm like, "I will. And, you know, never did. And I regret, I've only heard, you know, incredible stories about it. It sounds magnificent.
Yeah, Tom's new show is set around where that house is based.
Oh, brilliant.
Oh,
Brilliant.
I knew it was in France,
Yeah,
but I didn't
monsieur.
know it was near there.
Yeah, it's in the town. It's in the exact town. I was thinking to myself, I wonder if
Ah,
there's a connection.
hanging
And then, you know,
Maybe they'll use it for a location.
It's funny too. You talk about process, and when Tom didn't talk about his process and as a writer in detail, and he was, you know, he was like this Hemingway-esque figure, right? So we'd party hard on that show, right? So we'd all go out, we'd drink together, and he had that Hemingway discipline where he would get, no matter what had happened, he'd be at his desk at like 5 o'clock in the morning writing.
Yeah.
And he wrote everything freehand. Maybe he talked to you about this and you
Yeah,
didn't hear
he
it.
said.
Like,
Yeah, he just said that. Yeah.
yeah, it was so cool. And I was just always admire that. And then you know, and just that Hemingway discipline, then Sunil would have to, you know, transpose it into the computer or whatever like that. But he would write everything in hand on yellow pads and pencil. And it was just like, because, you know, we all had our romantic aspirations, but that definitely always struck me as like very Hemingway-esque and admirable.
Apparently, he used to do a one-man show every year as well to keep himself sharp. And I can't remember now who told us that, but yeah.
I just remember
Yeah,
his
he's
leather
fascinating.
jacket also. I remember thinking,
Oh, yeah.
anybody like a producer that could still rock a leather jacket, and he had long hair. His hair was very long then. It was always like that kid. He would hang out with the crew. You know, he was
Yeah,
very,
he was cool.
Yeah,
He was super cool.
Well, guys, I think we're I feel like we're at a good point.
Great.
Do you have any last final thoughts, Reed, or anything you want to share that we haven't talked about before we part ways today? Because you can always come back for a part 2 at some point.
Oh, of
but
course.
yeah,
I mean,
always welcome.
it's such a treat to talk about it with you, because like I say, like it's not a show that I did. It's a profound, a huge part of my life, and I feel so affectionate about it, and so gosh darn lucky that I got to be a part of it. And it's amazing how it all came together, and I got to work with such insanely talented people, incredible writers, incredible directors, and cast, that it was just unassailable. And so no, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. I mean, my favorite crabs were I think I like to go to Bill's Terrace Inn over in Essex on Eastern Road.
Oh.
And that was about, because I just love it. I think they've changed it, but at the time it was just like the back of a bar, and they just they'd hand you a roll of paper towels, and there's paper on the table and a pitcher of beer. And I was like, this is
And
perfect.
dump the crabs on the table.
Dump those crabs, and they'd have the big ones. But yeah, no, I thank you so much for, it's just been a real pleasure to relive some of this with you. And I'm so glad you're doing this show, because I have to tell you, I mean, this show matters to people. really matters. I can't tell you how many. I have friends who I only have because they approach me, and mostly writers who are like, that show formed me and it changed me, and they just introduced themselves to me. I've got friends. I'll hang out with guys with beers, like, hey, a whole group of just look me up, a bunch of LA writers who look me up on Twitter, and I'm like, yeah, they want to hear the Homicide stories, and I was like, sure. And then here in Toronto, one of my closest friends, he just came up to me while I'm having oysters with my family, and just like, that show changed my life, and it really did, and it it its staying power is a testament to Tom and the cast and the crew and just and Baltimore. I mean, so it's not, as you said, without except for cell phones, it still works today. It's a great piece of art, and I was lucky that I was able to hand in the kissy face and get a gun.
Right. Well, and thank you. Thanks for,
Thank you, Reed.
following us before, Chris noticed. It was like, wait a minute, Reed Diamond's following us. We got to get him on the show. So
Oh, heck
thank
yeah.
you for your
Yes.
your enthusiasm and your time and everything. We really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Pleasure. You guys are doing a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. Well, everybody, that was Reed Diamond. Susan, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share? Because I thought it was such an interesting chat. Reed was so enthusiastic. His enthusiasm really was infectious.
Yes, his enthusiasm, and I like to mention, because I think you mentioned it in the podcast, that he started following us.
Yeah.
When we first started the podcast, and he was emailing when we emailed him to be on the show, was just jumped on it. He was
Yeah.
very excited about it,
That's
and
so
also
cool.
very complimentary about not just doing it, but also the conversations that we were having. So it was great to talk to him, and also it was a very deep conversation for him. He talked about, as many people have, what an influence the show was on their careers. But he really went deep on what that influence was and how much it changed him. And at one point, he did say, not just as an actor, but changed him as a person, which I think is, it really speaks to the depth, I think, that the show reached, and also the depth at which the actors rose to the occasion. And some of that emotion, I think, came out on the screen
Yeah.
for him,
Yeah.
because it was such a profound experience for him.
Well, yeah, he was only 28, wasn't he, when he joined the show? He was 28 years old and, thrown in the deep end on a pretty established series by this point. And yeah, as he was saying, I think like there was a slight fear of that he was being brought in by an agenda, not of Reed's, but of the networks, to kind of change things. And so people were a little bit distant with him at the beginning, and he had to kind of prove himself. And obviously he had his own agenda because he wanted to get away from this sort of Johnny Depp floppy hair casting that he seemed to be getting. Was it the kissy
Johnny
boy?
Depp type?
Yeah.
That was interesting.
Yeah. And he wanted, he wanted to do more kind of gritty and serious roles. And yeah, no, it was really, really interesting.
And it did make me think, it tied in a little bit with Tom Fontana's conversation. I think that was our second episode, where Tom talked about, as they were casting, and one of the casting directors said, please get me a hunk. And every time Tom would call her and she'd say, who did you get? It was like Ned Beatty. It was, it was so and so and so and so. And then the last position open, and I hope you got me a hunk. And he says, Richard Belzer. So maybe she was happy.
Yeah.
Even though Reed didn't want to be typecast as a hunk. Maybe that's why, he was eventually brought on.
Yeah.
But obviously, his character was not that in the show. And he really grew and had a lot of different facets to the character. And, I say it too much, but his character arc also really complex and interesting to hear him talk about that.
He went to some very dark places. I mean, I always think of that. There's this moment in one of the episodes where he poses next to a dead body for a photograph. And that was kind of like after shooting Luther Mahoney, I think that's the next darkest thing that his character did. And it was quite a journey.
and uncomfortable. That was an uncomfortable scene when he
Mm,
did that. It was
mm,
like, wow, don't do that. Even though
yeah.
you know it's his character. I also loved all the, and he talked about this too, all the happenstance, in his career.
Mm.
Um, that he knew Andre from Juilliard, and that
Yeah,
he
it was really
worked
interesting.
with Eric Stoltz and Tate Donovan in Memphis Belle,
Great film. Yeah.
which was funny because the comparison that when he sees Homicide cast or crew now, he talks about feeling like he's meeting up again with his platoon mates,
Mm,
and certainly with Memphis Belle and bringing Eric and Tate on the show was true because they were already friends,
yeah.
but also friends who had gone through boot camp together
Yes,
in
yeah.
England, which was that was a great
It's
story.
so hilarious. That guy was just drinking and shooting all day.
Drinking and shooting. Are you familiar with with the property he talked about and where it
To
is?
be fair, not the guy. I know the type of guy he's talking about because I've certainly in my past, my father was a competition clay pigeon shooter, so we used to
Oh,
go out
wow.
occasionally on Sundays and go clay pigeon shooting and kind of deep in the country somewhere. And so you do meet some very interesting, colourful characters in the world of shooting. So the guy Reed describes, I've certainly met people like that, but I've not met that particular guy. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
And I loved his
Mm.
comparison between the New York audition scene and the
Yeah.
LA
Oh,
audition
yes,
scene.
yes, that's brilliant.
That
The air
was
conditioned car.
great. Not to
Mm,
diss New York, but it's a different sensibility, obviously.
yeah.
Like just like not even sit down and shut up. Like they apparently didn't even talk to them. It's like
No,
he said there's
no.
4 chairs for 10 actors, and
Yeah.
you could hear the other person's a sweaty little box of a room, and then he gets to LA and there's a receptionist who hands him a bottle of water and says, "We're so glad you're here."
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just that was funny.
Mm,
I've never lived in New York,
mm,
but having lived in LA, I thought
yeah.
that was
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. And it was interesting as well, talk about we would talk about this off air as well. It's very interesting the whole how in back in the 90s TV and film was treated very separately, and if you'd starred in TV it was unlikely you would be in a film as a lead at least, and how that sort of changed so dramatically these days. Now it's sort of the other way around. It's sort of film stars are desperate to get in TV now, whilst in the older days it was the other way around. So I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, and I love that he put Homicide in the historical context of this idea of it sparking the idea of prestige television
Yeah.
before cable,
Mm,
before HBO, which then, of course, didn't copy Homicide, but then cable became the
mm,
place where
mm,
you could see that kind of
mm,
prestige television.
mm,
Although we were a network show,
yeah.
obviously at the time, and I love that he said, we could do a cop show with no profanity, and you laughed really hard, like I never thought of
Yeah.
that.
It's so
You know,
true. Whilst now, if you made Homicide today, I'm sure they would throw in quite a bit of profanity.
sure. And there were things I didn't know as a crew person. I said I probably said it in the show. We're humping equipment around and worried about where we are going to go
Mm,
next. And I wasn't aware. He talks about the tension, some of the tension between the actors.
mm,
I don't. Yeah, I have a hard time remembering that. Maybe if it was displayed on the set,
mm,
we would have seen it. But
mm,
it was interesting to hear him talk about, his reception
mm,
and but also that worked for him in the character. That same would have happened if he'd come in as a greenhorn on an actual homicide unit. He would have been treated
mm,
icily until he proved himself.
mm,
I thought that was an insightful and
mm.
interesting. It was something that I didn't know in any deep way, for
Yeah,
sure.
and the other side of that story as well was the publicity photos and the reactions to them, and the NBC
Yeah, and at first,
photographer. Yeah,
yeah, they didn't wanna do it. I guess that's 'cause, they're working all day. You don't
yeah,
wanna add
yeah,
work on top of your work. I
yeah.
wasn't sure at first if he meant the, 'cause, I don't know if they did it every year, but they would at some point, obviously, they redid, shooting their portraits for the credits,
Yeah,
which they did differently after they changed the opening
yeah, yeah,
credits.
yeah.
I don't know if that was a season 4 or 3. But no, yeah, it was publicity photos,
Mm,
and that was another thing, and maybe I was aware of it at the time, that there was a photographer set up
Yeah.
somewhere, either in the building or in another building or in the office or, somewhere, doing publicity
Yeah.
shots, which I, probably never saw.
I've seen a few of them. The classic one I've seen from series 1 is they're outside the steps, kind of all crowding around a body basically under a sheet, and all looking kind of serious. And so it's I can imagine that being quite difficult to achieve with all those people. They don't want to do it. So.
Yeah, and I guess not wanting to do it because you're already working all day, I guess. Or it takes them out of character, or
Yeah. Well, when I look at those pictures now, it does make me chuckle a
right.
bit. I'd love to see. I don't know who the photographer was. We'll see if I can track them down, because
Oh,
it's quite
that's
funny to see if there's
Yeah.
some
If you're out there,
outtakes.
that's
So there we go.
let's see the angry face outtakes, though. Just kidding.
That would be funny. That would be funny.
But yeah, delightful. It was you could it was his excitement was palpable, and it was so nice to hear from him and from others that they're
Yeah.
happy we're doing the
Yeah.
podcast.
Well, no, Reed's passion really shone through, and his enthusiasm for this podcast too, which was very kind of him. It's nice to interview somebody who's actually enjoying the show that they're actually on. So that's really cool. So no, it was fantastic, and his talk about his sort of personal journey and the connection to the show. It was really great for Reed to share that with us. I really appreciate that. So
Yeah. Thanks, Reed.
thank you, Reed, and everybody. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and don't forget to connect with us on social media. We are on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram. And we are just at Homicide Pod on all of those. And also you can check out our website, which is homicidelife.on-the-set.com. And it's got links to our social media on there. And it's also got links to the episodes. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. And we will be back soon.
Thanks.
Take care.